Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I always thought my father, Dr. Charles Carter, was a man of secrets. Growing up, I noticed his peculiar habits, locking away certain rooms, whispering cryptic phrases when he thought no one was listening, and taking long, unexplained trips to remote locations. After his passing, I inherited the old family home in a small town in Minnesota. It was a house filled with creaking wood floors, dusty bookshelves, and a haunting stillness that came alive at night. I had never dared to venture into the basement before, but after settling in with my wife Jessica, curiosity got the better of me. The basement door had always stuck a little, the old wood swollen from years of humidity. That day, with Jessica out grocery shopping, I finally decided to explore. Armed with a flashlight, I pushed the door open and descended the wooden stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the air smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic. In the far corner, I spotted a large wooden chest. It was the kind you'd expect to see in pirate movies, with iron hinges and a heavy lock, though the lock had long since rusted away. I hesitated before opening it, a strange unease settling in my stomach. When I finally lifted the lid, a puff of dust rose into the air, making me cough. Inside, I found an assortment of oddities: yellowed papers covered in scribbled notes, small vials of strange powders, and a few ancient-looking trinkets. And then I saw it. The mask. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Made of stone, it was smooth and perfectly round, yet grotesque in its design. 2 eye holes were carved unevenly, just enough to make it unsettling. A slit for a mouth revealed jagged, etched teeth, and additional rows of teeth were carved above and below the mouth. It was heavy, much heavier than I expected, and holding it sent a strange, almost electric sensation through my fingers. Next to the mask lay a knife, its blade made of what appeared to be bone. The handle was wrapped in aged leather, and strange symbols were etched along the blade's surface. I couldn't help but feel a mix of fascination and dread. What on earth was my father doing with these things? I carried the mask and the knife upstairs, placing them on the dining table for a better look. Jessica came home shortly after and found me staring at the mask. "What's that?" she asked, setting the grocery bags on the counter. "I found it in the basement," I said, trying to sound casual. "I think it belonged to my dad." Jessica walked over, her expression shifting from curiosity to discomfort. "Ethan, that thing is unsettling. What's it even supposed to be?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But isn't it kind of cool? It feels important, like it has a history." She raised an eyebrow. "It looks like it belongs in a horror movie. You should get rid of it." "Come on," I said, laughing. "It's just a mask. Besides, it's probably worth something. Maybe it's an artifact from one of Dad's archaeological trips." Jessica sighed. "Fine, but don't expect me to hang around if you're going to keep creepy stuff like this in the house." I promised her I'd keep it in my study, but an idea was already forming in my head. Jessica hated horror movies. She'd always been the type to get scared easily, jumping at the smallest noise or shadow. I thought it might be funny to use the mask to pull a little prank on her. After all, what's the harm in a harmless scare? That night, I waited until Jessica was in the kitchen washing dishes. The sound of running water drowned out my movements as I slipped the mask over my face. It was heavier than I expected, and the stone pressed uncomfortably against my skin. My breath felt hot and trapped behind the mask, and for a moment I considered taking it off. But the thought of Jessica's reaction spurred me on. I crept up the stairs from the basement, each step creaking beneath my weight. The hardwood floor of the living room felt cool under my bare feet as I moved toward the kitchen. The mask's eye holes limited my vision, but I could see Jessica standing at the sink, her back to me, her dark hair tied up in a bun. She was humming softly to herself, completely unaware of my presence. I took a deep breath, the excitement and nerves mixing in my chest. Slowly I reached out and tapped her shoulder. She turned, and the moment her eyes locked onto the mask, she screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound that pierced the air. Before I could react, she grabbed a frying pan from the counter and swung it at me. The heavy metal connected with my side, sending a jolt of pain through my ribs. I stumbled backward, clutching my side, as she reached for a knife.
"Jessica, wait!"
I shouted, pulling the mask off my face.
"It's me, it's just me!"
She froze, the knife still raised, her chest heaving with panic.
"Ethan, what the hell is wrong with you?"
I dropped the mask onto the floor, raising my hands in surrender.
"I was just trying to scare you. It was a joke."
Her expression shifted from fear to fury.
"A joke? You call that a joke? I could have killed you, Ethan. What were you thinking?"
I winced, still holding my side. "I didn't think you'd react like that. I thought you'd just scream or something, not go full psycho on me." Jessica glared at me, her eyes narrowing.
"Don't you dare make this my fault. That mask is terrifying, Ethan. Where did you even find it?"
"In the basement," I said, still catching my breath. "It was in one of Dad's old boxes. I thought it was interesting." She picked up the mask, examining it closely. "It looks ancient. Do you think it's valuable?" "Maybe," I said, shrugging. "But I don't want to sell it. It's one of the only things I have left of Dad. It feels significant." Jessica sighed, setting the mask down on the counter. "If you want to keep it, fine. But it stays in your study, and I don't want to see it. And no more pranks, Ethan. I mean it." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and regret. "No more pranks, I promise." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the mask. There was something about it that felt off. It wasn't just the way it looked or the strange energy it seemed to emit. It was the way it seemed to stare at me, even when I wasn't looking at it. Jessica fell asleep quickly, her soft snores filling the room. But I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The image of the mask burned into my mind. I told myself it was just an old relic, a harmless artifact from my father's past. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that bringing it into the house had awakened something, a presence that had been waiting, hidden in the shadows, for far too long. The next morning, I woke to an empty bed. Jessica had left a note on the nightstand. "Ethan went out for errands. Breakfast is in the fridge. Please move that mask to your study like we agreed. Love you." I sighed, rubbing my temples. Last night's prank had been a stupid idea, and I felt guilty for scaring Jessica like that. I figured moving the mask and the knife to my study would be a peace offering, a small step toward smoothing things over. The mask was still sitting on the kitchen counter, its unsettling features catching the morning light. As I picked it up, I noticed how cold it felt, unnaturally so, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I carried it to my study, a small room filled with my father's old books, awards, and other mementos. The walls were lined with shelves, and a large oak desk sat in the center. I placed the mask on one of the shelves, propping it up against a row of dusty books. The bone knife went on the desk beneath it. I stepped back, trying to decide if the arrangement looked right. It didn't. No matter how I positioned the mask, it seemed wrong, as if it didn't belong there, or anywhere. Its uneven eye holes seemed to follow me, the jagged teeth hinting at a sinister grin. Shaking my head, I turned away and left the room, closing the door behind me. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Jessica returned home around noon, and we spent the afternoon cleaning the house. She seemed in better spirits, which made me feel a little less guilty about the prank. By evening, we were lounging on the couch watching a movie. Jessica had her feet tucked under her, a bowl of popcorn balanced on her lap. I was just starting to relax when I thought I heard something. A faint scraping sound, like metal against wood. I paused the movie. "Did you hear that?" Jessica frowned. "Hear what?" "That noise. It sounded like, I don't know, something moving." She rolled her eyes. "Ethan, if this is another prank..." "It's not," I interrupted. "I swear." She sighed, setting the popcorn aside. "Fine. Go check it out, brave protector." I got up, my heart beating a little faster than I cared to admit. The sound seemed to be coming from the study. As I approached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. No answer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. Everything seemed to be in place. The books, the desk, the mask. Wait. The mask wasn't where I had left it. It was on the desk now, tilted at an angle as if it had been placed there carelessly. The bone knife was lying beside it, the tip pointing toward the edge of the desk. I frowned, stepping closer. "Jessica?" I called out again, though I knew she was still on the couch. As I reached for the mask, a sudden chill filled the room. The air seemed heavier, pressing against my chest. My hand hovered over the mask, hesitant, and then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A low, murmuring voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. I jerked my hand back, my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I demanded, spinning around. The room was empty. I backed out of the study, closing the door firmly behind me. My hands were trembling as I returned to the living room. Jessica looked up, a bemused expression on her face. "Well, did you find the boogeyman?" "No," I said quickly. "It was nothing. Probably just the wind." She smirked. "The wind? In the study?" "Sure, Ethan." I forced a laugh, sitting down beside her. But my mind was still in the study, replaying the whisper over and over. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jessica was out cold, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house felt different, as if the very walls were watching me. Every creak and groan seemed amplified, each sound sending a jolt of fear through me. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on trying to sleep and decided to get a glass of water. As I walked past the study, I stopped. The door was open again. I knew I had closed it earlier. Swallowing hard, I stepped closer. The hallway light cast a dim glow into the room, enough for me to see that the mask was no longer on the desk. It was on the floor. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my ears. The mask seemed to be staring back, its uneven eye holes filled with shadows. I wanted to pick it up, to put it back on the shelf, but my feet refused to move. A part of me was terrified that if I touched it, something would happen, something I couldn't explain or control. And then, the whisper returned. This time it was louder, clearer. The words were still foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. Commanding, insistent. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The mask remained on the floor, its expression unchanging. "Jessica!" I shouted, my voice cracking. She appeared at the top of the stairs a moment later, her face a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What is it, Ethan? It's the middle of the night." "The mask," I said, pointing toward the study. "It moved. I swear it moved." Jessica sighed, rubbing her temples. "Ethan, you're letting this thing get to you. It's just a mask. Maybe it fell off the desk or something." "No," I insisted. "I left it on the shelf.
Then it was on the desk. Now it's on the floor. And there's this whispering.
She gave me a long, tired look. You've been stressed out since your dad died. Maybe you're just imagining things. I'm not imagining it, I said, my voice rising. Please, just come look. Reluctantly, she followed me into the study. I flipped on the light, revealing the mask lying in the center of the room. Jessica picked it up, examining it. It's heavy. If it fell, it would have made a noise. Are you sure you didn't move it? I shook my head. I didn't touch it. She placed the mask back on the shelf and turned to me. Ethan, I think you need to take a break. Maybe spend some time away from the house. This whole thing with your dad, the inheritance, it's a lot. It's messing with your head. I wanted to argue, but her words hit a nerve. Maybe I was letting my grief and stress get the better of me. Maybe the mask was just an old relic, and I was projecting my own fears onto it. Okay, I said finally. Maybe you're right. Jessica smiled, giving my arm a reassuring squeeze. Come on, let's try to get some sleep. The next morning I woke to find Jessica in the kitchen making coffee. The mask was still in the study, and nothing strange had happened during the night. I began to convince myself that Jessica was right, that it was all in my head. But then, as we sat down for breakfast, Jessica frowned. Ethan, she said, her voice low. What is it? I asked, my stomach tightening. She pointed toward the window. The backyard was a mess. Branches snapped, the garden trampled, and strange symbols etched into the dirt. What the hell? I muttered, standing up. We both went outside to get a closer look. The symbols were crude but deliberate, forming a circle around a single point. At the center of the circle was a small, charred patch of earth, as if someone had lit a fire there. Do you think it's kids? Jessica asked, her voice shaking. I don't know, I said, though I didn't believe it. As we stood there, a cold breeze swept through the yard, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. For the first time, I felt truly afraid, not just for myself, but for Jessica. Something was wrong. Something had been unleashed, and I was starting to think it all had to do with that mask. Jessica and I stood frozen in the backyard, staring at the strange symbols etched into the dirt. The charred patch in the center seemed to radiate unease, like it was daring us to step closer. Neither of us moved. Ethan, we need to call the police, Jessica said, her voice trembling. I nodded, though I doubted the police would have any answers. This didn't feel like some neighborhood prank or random act of vandalism. It felt intentional, targeted. Jessica went inside to grab her phone, leaving me alone with the ominous circle. As I crouched down to examine it, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tiny shards of what looked like bone scattered around the edges of the burnt spot. The sight made my stomach churn. They weren't large, just fragments, but they were unmistakable. Ethan? Jessica called from the doorway. They're sending someone over, but it might be a while. I straightened up, brushing dirt from my hands. Okay, let's just stay inside until they get here. We sat in tense silence in the living room, waiting for the police. Jessica clutched her coffee mug like it was a lifeline, while I stared out the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the yard. I don't get it, Jessica said finally. Why would someone do this? It's like a ritual or something. I didn't respond. My thoughts kept drifting back to the mask and the strange whispering I'd heard the night before. I hadn't told Jessica about the bone fragments, and I wasn't sure I ever would. When the police finally arrived, they were as baffled as we were. A tall, middle-aged officer named Detective Harris took the lead, asking us a series of routine questions. Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to scare you? He asked. No, Jessica said firmly. We don't even know most of our neighbors. And nothing like this has happened before? Never, I said. Harris nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. Well, it's probably just some kids messing around. Halloween's coming up. Maybe it's part of some prank or initiation. Jessica and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us believed it was that simple, but there wasn't much else we could say. After taking a few photos and collecting samples from the scene, Harris left, promising to follow up if they found anything. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but a heavy tension hung in the air. Jessica suggested we stay at a hotel for the night, but I convinced her to wait. I didn't want to leave the house. I wanted to face whatever this was head on. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself drawn back to the study. The mask sat on the shelf, its shadow stretching across the wall in the dim light. I stared at it for a long time, the whispers from the night before echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to destroy it, to smash it into pieces and bury the remains. But another part of me, a deeper, more curious part, needed answers. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the mask and the bone knife and carried them to the kitchen. Jessica was upstairs taking a shower, so I had the house to myself. I set the mask and knife on the table, then pulled out my laptop. If these objects had any history, any connection to the symbols in the yard, I was going to find it. Hours passed as I scoured the internet for anything remotely similar to what I'd found in my father's basement. I searched for ancient masks, bone knives, ritual symbols, anything that might provide a clue. Finally, I stumbled upon a forum dedicated to obscure artifacts and their histories. Most of the posts were harmless, collectors showing off their finds, discussing their origins, but one thread caught my eye. The title read, "The Mask of Velshan, Cursed Artifact or Hoax." My heart raced as I clicked on it. The original post included a grainy photo of a mask that looked eerily similar to the one sitting on my table. The uneven eye holes, the jagged teeth, it was all there. The user claimed the mask was an ancient relic from a forgotten civilization, believed to be used in rituals meant to summon spirits or otherworldly entities. According to legend, the mask acted as a conduit, allowing its wearer to communicate with the beyond, but at a cost. The thread was filled with replies, some dismissing the story as nonsense, others sharing similar tales of cursed artifacts and strange occurrences. One comment in particular stood out. "If you have this mask, get rid of it immediately. Destroy it if you can. It's not just a relic, it's a beacon, and once it's activated, it's nearly impossible to stop what comes through." A chill ran down my spine. "Ethan?" Jessica's voice startled me, and I quickly closed the laptop. She stood in the doorway, her hair damp from the shower. "What are you doing?" she asked, eyeing the mask and knife on the table. "Just researching," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She frowned. "Ethan, this obsession isn't healthy. You're scaring me." "I'm not obsessed," I said defensively. "I'm just trying to understand what we're dealing with." Jessica sighed, shaking her head. "I think we should get rid of that thing. Tonight." I hesitated, her words echoing the warning I'd just read. But something deep inside me resisted the idea. I needed to know more. "Okay," I lied. "We'll get rid of it tomorrow." Jessica nodded, seemingly satisfied, and went upstairs to bed. Later that night, I found myself back in the study, unable to sleep. The mask was there, staring at me from the shelf. The whispering returned, louder this time, and I realized something chilling. It wasn't coming from the mask. It was coming from the basement. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder as I approached the basement door, each word incomprehensible but dripping with malice. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, musty space below. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, shining my flashlight into the gloom. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a faint thud echoed from the far corner of the basement. I took a shaky step down, then another, the wooden stairs groaning under my weight. The air grew colder with each step, and the beam of my flashlight seemed to struggle against the darkness. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. The symbols from the backyard had been carved into the concrete floor, forming a circle identical to the one outside. At the center lay another charred patch, surrounded by more fragments of bone. And standing just outside the circle, illuminated by my flashlight, was the mask. It shouldn't have been there. I had left it in the study, upstairs. My breathing quickened as I stepped closer, the cold seeping into my skin. The mask seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, its jagged grin daring me to come closer. Against my better judgment, I reached out and picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the surface, a searing pain shot through my hand, and I dropped the mask with a cry. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, filling the basement with an oppressive noise. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. Then, from the shadows, something moved. It was quick, almost too quick to see, but I caught a glimpse of it. A figure, hunched and gaunt, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me and locking it. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. Jessica appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. "Ethan, what's going on?" I looked up at her, my hands trembling. "We need to leave. Now." She started to protest, but something in my expression stopped her. She nodded, grabbing her coat and keys. As we stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap. I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see something watching us from the windows. But there was nothing. For now. As we drove away, Jessica asked, "Ethan, what's happening? What did you see?" I shook my head, unable to put it into words. All I knew was that the mask wasn't just an artifact. It was something far worse. The tires hummed against the asphalt as Jessica and I drove aimlessly through the dark streets. The oppressive silence between us was interrupted only by the occasional clicking of the turn signal. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my mind racing with the events of the past few hours. "What's going on, Ethan?" Jessica finally asked, her voice a mix of fear and frustration. "You said we needed to leave, but you haven't told me why. What's happening in our house?" I exhaled shakily, glancing at her. Her face was pale, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She deserved answers, but I didn't know where to begin. "It's the mask," I said at last, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. There's something wrong with it. Something evil." Jessica frowned. "Evil? Ethan, listen to yourself. It's just an old artifact, probably some weird cultural thing. You're letting your imagination get the better of you." "No," I said firmly, gripping the wheel tighter. "It's not just an artifact. I found it in my dad's basement, along with that bone knife. And ever since then, strange things have been happening. The symbols, the whispers. I saw something in the basement, Jess. Something that shouldn't exist." Her eyes widened. "You're scaring me." I didn't respond. The truth was, I was scaring myself too. We ended up at a small diner on the outskirts of town, one of those 24-hour places that always smelled like stale coffee and grease. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as we slid into a booth, the plastic seats sticking to our skin. Jessica ordered tea, but I went straight for black coffee, hoping the caffeine would steady my nerves. "What do we do now?" she asked, her hands wrapped tightly around the mug. I hesitated. "I think we need help. Someone who knows about this kind of thing. Maybe a historian or a paranormal investigator." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "A paranormal investigator? Do you hear yourself? This isn't a ghost story, Ethan." "Then what is it?" I snapped, louder than I intended. A couple of truckers at the counter glanced our way, and I lowered my voice. "You didn't see what I saw, Jess. That thing in the basement. It wasn't human. She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. Fine. Who do we even call for something like this? I thought back to the forum I'd found earlier. One of the commenters, a user named Thorn, had seemed knowledgeable about the mask and its supposed history. They'd warned about its dangers, urging anyone who encountered it to destroy it immediately. There's someone online, I said finally. They seem to know about the mask. Maybe they can help. Jessica frowned. You trust some random stranger on the internet with this? Do you have a better idea? She didn't reply. Back at the diner, using my laptop, I logged into the forum and sent a private message to Thorn, explaining what had happened and asking for their advice. I didn't expect an immediate response, but to my surprise, a reply came within minutes. Thorn, you have the Mask of Velshan. That's bad. Really bad. The message sent a chill down my spine. I quickly typed back, what do you know about it? What's happening to us? Thorn responded, the mask is cursed. It's a relic from an ancient cult that believed in summoning spirits from the other side. But it's not just a tool. It's a beacon. Once activated, it draws things, dark things. And it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants. I read the message aloud to Jessica, who paled. What does it want? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I typed the question, and Thorn's reply came almost instantly. Thorn, blood, sacrifice. That's how it was used in the past. The more blood spilled in its presence, the stronger it becomes. Jessica gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. We need to get rid of it, she said. Right now. I nodded. Thorn, how do we destroy it? There was a long pause before the reply came. Thorn, destroying it isn't easy. Fire won't work. You have to take it back to where it came from, to its origin. Only then can it be broken. Where is that? I typed frantically. Thorn, do you know where your father got it? That's where you need to go, and hurry. The longer you keep it, the worse things will get. I sat back, my mind racing. My father had traveled all over the world for his research, collecting artifacts from ancient civilizations, but I remembered him talking about a dig site in New Mexico, a remote location where he'd found several unusual items. I think it's New Mexico, I said. That's where he got it. Jessica looked at me, her fear replaced by determination. Then that's where we're going. The drive to New Mexico was long and grueling. We barely spoke, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between us. Jessica alternated between staring out the window and checking her phone for updates from Thorn. As we crossed into the desert, the air grew cooler, and the landscape became barren and foreboding. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, where secrets could be buried for centuries. This is it, I said as we approached the site. It wasn't much to look at, just a stretch of dry, cracked earth surrounded by jagged rocks. But there was a palpable energy in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. Jessica and I stepped out of the car, clutching flashlights and a small bag containing the mask and knife. What now? She asked, her voice trembling. I pulled out my phone and checked the latest message from Thorn. Thorn, find the place where it was unearthed. You'll know it when you see it. The ground will feel wrong. Jessica and I began searching, our footsteps crunching against the dry earth. The wind howled through the rocks, carrying with it an eerie, almost mournful sound. After what felt like hours, we found it. A small pit, partially caved in, lay hidden among the rocks. The earth around it was darker than the surrounding desert, almost black, and a faint metallic smell lingered in the air. This has to be it, I said, my voice barely audible. Jessica nodded, her grip tightening on the bag. We placed the mask and knife in the pit, their ominous presence almost too much to bear. What now? Jessica asked. I hesitated,
then read Thorn's final instructions. Thorn, once you've found the origin site, you must perform a ritual to break the curse. Draw a circle around the items with salt, light a fire, and chant these words. Velshen's grip, release thy hold. Spirits bound, return to cold. Repeat until the objects are consumed by the flames. Do not stop, no matter what happens. We quickly followed the instructions, pouring salt around the pit and lighting a small fire. The flames flickered weakly, as if struggling against an unseen force. Jessica and I knelt beside the pit, holding hands as we began to chant. Velshen's grip, release thy hold. Spirits bound, return to cold. The wind picked up, howling around us like a living thing. The ground trembled beneath our knees, and the fire roared to life, its flames turning an unnatural shade of green. Velshen's grip, release thy hold. Spirits bound, return to cold. The mask and knife began to shake, their surfaces glowing with a malevolent light. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the desert, sending chills down my spine. Don't stop, I shouted over the wind. Jessica's voice wavered, but she kept chanting. The growling grew louder, joined by a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all around us. Shadows danced at the edges of the firelight, their shapes shifting and writhing like living things. Velshen's grip, release thy hold. Spirits bound, return to cold. The mask let out a piercing scream, and for a moment I thought my ears would burst. The fire surged higher, consuming the mask and knife in a blinding burst of light. Then silence. The wind stopped. The whispers vanished. The fire burned out, leaving only ash in its wake. Jessica and I sat there, trembling, staring at the pit. The mask and knife were gone, their curse seemingly lifted. Is it over? Jessica whispered. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. As we drove away from the site, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something deeper than the curse. For now, though, the nightmare was over, or so we thought. The journey back home felt eerily quiet. Jessica dozed off in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, while I kept my hands locked on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The mask and knife were gone, destroyed in that hellish blaze, but the unease clung to me like smoke from a lingering fire. I wanted to believe it was over. I really did. But something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. We reached our town just as the sun was beginning to rise, the pale light breaking over the horizon. Jessica stirred as I pulled into the driveway, rubbing her eyes and glancing at the house. Home, sweet home, she murmured, her voice laced with exhaustion. I nodded, though the sight of our house didn't comfort me. Instead, it filled me with a strange sense of dread. We stepped inside, and everything seemed normal, too normal. The air was still, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Jessica headed straight for the bathroom, mumbling something about needing a shower, while I lingered in the living room. The basement door caught my eye. It was closed now, just as we'd left it, but the memory of what I'd seen down there, the shifting shadows, the strange symbols, the thing, made my skin crawl. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. The mask was gone. The nightmare was over. Wasn't it? Jessica emerged from the shower looking more like herself, her hair damp and her face scrubbed clean. She flopped onto the couch beside me, pulling a blanket over her lap. What now? She asked, her voice quiet. I shrugged. We try to move on, I guess. Pretend none of this ever happened. She frowned. Do you think it's really over? I wanted to say yes, to reassure her, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I muttered, I hope so. Jessica didn't press further, and we spent the rest of the morning in silence, too drained to talk. That night, the house felt different. The air was heavy,
the kind of oppressive stillness that made it hard to breathe. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes seemed amplified, echoing through the darkness like a warning. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events in the desert. The way the mask had screamed as it burned, the unnatural green flames, the whispers that had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Just as I was beginning to drift off, a sound jolted me awake. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from downstairs. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Jessica?" I whispered, glancing at her sleeping form beside me. She didn't stir. The tapping grew louder. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. As I descended the stairs, the tapping stopped. I froze, listening. Nothing. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the living room. Everything seemed normal. The furniture was in its place, the curtains drawn, the shadows still. Then I saw it. A single word, scrawled in ash across the coffee table. Return. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The mask and knife were gone, destroyed in the desert. How could this still be happening? The words seemed to pulse, the letters shifting slightly as though they were alive. "Jessica!" I called, my voice trembling. Footsteps pounded down the stairs, and Jessica appeared, her eyes wide and panicked. "What is it?" she asked. I pointed to the table, unable to speak. She followed my gaze, and her face went pale. "What the hell?" "It's not over," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not over." We spent the next hour scouring the house, looking for any other signs of the curse. The basement was the first place we checked, but it was empty. No shadows, no symbols, nothing. Yet the oppressive feeling lingered, growing stronger with every passing minute. "What does it want?" Jessica asked as we sat huddled in the living room, our backs to the wall. I shook my head. "I don't know. Thorne said destroying the mask would break the curse, but it didn't," she finished, her voice trembling. I pulled out my phone and opened the forum, hoping to find another message from Thorne. There was nothing. I sent another frantic message, explaining what had happened and begging for guidance. Hours passed with no reply. That night, the dreams came. I was back in the desert, standing in the pit where we'd burned the mask and knife. The fire was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of darkness. Shapes moved within it, twisted, shadowy forms that seemed to watch me with unseen eyes. A voice echoed from the void, deep and guttural. "Blood calls to blood. You cannot escape." I woke with a start, gasping for air. Jessica was beside me, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "You had it too," she said, her voice shaking. I nodded. The next day, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as the hours passed, they grew louder, more insistent. Jessica and I tried to block them out, covering our ears and blasting music, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't just external, they were inside our heads, gnawing at our sanity. By evening, the symbols had returned, appearing on the walls, the floors, even the ceilings. They glowed faintly, their lines pulsing with an otherworldly light. "We need to leave," Jessica said, her voice trembling. But deep down, we both knew it wouldn't make a difference. The curse wasn't tied to the house, it was tied to us. Desperate, I logged back into the forum and sent another message to Thorne. "It's not over. The mask is gone, but the whispers, the symbols, they're back. What do we do?" This time the reply came quickly. "Thorne, I was afraid of this. The mask was a vessel, but the entity it summoned is still tethered to you. Destroying the mask wasn't enough. I stared at the screen, my heart sinking. How do we stop it? I typed. Thorn. You can't. Not entirely. But you might be able to sever the tether. You'll need to perform another ritual. One of banishment. But it's dangerous. The entity will fight back. Tell me what to do, I replied, my hands trembling. Thorn's instructions were detailed and complex, involving sigils, incantations, and offerings. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to rid ourselves of the curse once and for all. Jessica and I gathered the necessary materials and prepared for the ritual. That night, we stood in the center of the living room, a circle of salt surrounding us. Candles flickered around the room, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. We began the incantation, our voices trembling but determined. As we chanted, the air grew colder, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. The symbols on the walls pulsed violently, their light blinding. Then, the shadows came. They poured from the walls, coalescing into a towering figure that loomed over us, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its eyes, if you could call them that, glowed with a malevolent light. "You cannot banish me!" it roared, its voice shaking the room. Jessica clutched my hand, her grip so tight it hurt. "Keep going!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. We continued the incantation, our voices rising in defiance. The entity lashed out, its shadowy tendrils slicing through the air. One of them struck Jessica, and she cried out, collapsing to the floor. "Jessica!" I dropped to my knees, cradling her. "I'm fine," she gasped, her face pale. "Just finish it." Summoning every ounce of courage, I stood and shouted the final words of the incantation. The entity let out a deafening scream, its form writhing and twisting as it began to dissolve. The room shook violently, the walls cracking under the force of its rage. Then, with a blinding flash of light, it was gone. Jessica and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The room was silent, the oppressive weight lifted. "Is it over?" Jessica whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't know. But for the first time in weeks, the house felt still. And that was enough. For now. The days following the banishment were unsettlingly quiet. The house, once alive with whispers and flickering shadows, now felt almost lifeless. Jessica and I tried to embrace the stillness, to let it reassure us, but the scars of what we'd endured ran too deep. I found myself jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes. Jessica wasn't much better, her eyes constantly darting to the corners of rooms, as if expecting the shadows to leap out at her. The ritual had worked, or at least it seemed to. But neither of us dared to voice our relief, afraid that speaking it aloud might summon something worse. 3 weeks passed. Life began to creep back into something resembling normalcy. Jessica returned to her classes, and I went back to work, though my mind often wandered. Sleep was still elusive, and when it came, it was plagued by dreams of dark forests and shifting shadows. One evening, Jessica suggested we go out for dinner. "Let's just get out of here for a bit," she said, her voice tentative. I hesitated, glancing around the house as if it might protest our leaving. But she was right. We needed a break. We ended up at a small diner on the edge of town. The place was cozy, filled with the smell of coffee and grilled food. For the first time in weeks, we laughed, the tension between us easing with each passing moment. It almost felt normal. We got home late, the moon high in the sky. The house greeted us with its familiar silence, and for once, it didn't feel oppressive. Jessica went straight to bed, but I lingered in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. My body was tired, but my mind was restless, the quiet somehow more unnerving than the chaos we'd lived through. I decided to check the forum, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just needed to see Thorn's name, to remind myself that someone out there understood what we'd been through. To my surprise, There was a message waiting for me. Thorn, is it done? Are you safe? I typed a reply, my fingers trembling slightly. I think so. It's been quiet. No whispers, no symbols. The house feels normal. The response came almost immediately. Thorn, good, but stay vigilant. These things have a way of lingering, even after banishment. The words sent a chill down my spine. I stared at the screen, debating whether to reply, but the sound of a door creaking upstairs pulled me away. Jessica, I called, my voice echoing in the quiet house. No response. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding. The hallway was dark, the faint glow from our bedroom the only light. I pushed open the door to find Jessica sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me. Hey, I said softly. You okay? She didn't respond. Jessica? I stepped closer, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. She turned slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unseeing. Blood calls to blood, she whispered, her voice hollow. I froze. The air around her shimmered, and for a moment I saw it. The shadow, faint but unmistakable, coiled around her like a living thing. No, I muttered, backing away. No, this can't be happening. Jessica stood, her movements stiff and unnatural. You thought you could escape, she said, her voice layered with something else, something inhuman. I stumbled out of the room, my mind racing. The ritual had worked. It had. So how was this happening? I grabbed my phone and typed a frantic message to Thorn. It's back. Jessica, it's in her. What do I do? The reply came almost instantly. Thorn, it must have found a new tether. You need to sever it. Now. How? I typed, my hands shaking. Thorn, a final sacrifice. The entity needs a host to survive. Deny it one, and it will be forced to retreat. I stared at the screen, the meaning of his words sinking in. No, I whispered. There has to be another way. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. Jessica appeared at the top of the stairs, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. You can't stop this, she said, her voice distorted. I am eternal. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched the phone, desperately searching for another answer. Jessica, fight it, I pleaded. You're stronger than this. You can beat it. She stepped closer, her eyes unblinking. She's already gone. And soon, you will be too. I backed into the living room, my mind racing. The salt circle from the previous ritual was still faintly visible on the floor. If I could lure her inside. Come on, I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The thing controlling Jessica smiled, a twisted, unnatural expression. As you wish. I darted into the circle, grabbing the nearest candle and lighting it with trembling hands. Jessica, or whatever had taken her, followed, its movements deliberate and predatory. As soon as she stepped inside the circle, I began chanting the banishment incantation. The air grew heavy, the shadows around her writhing violently. The entity screamed, its voice shaking the room, but I kept going, pouring every ounce of strength I had into the words. Jessica's body convulsed, her eyes rolling back as the shadow began to peel away from her. It screamed again, a sound of pure rage and pain. But then it stopped. The shadow surged forward, breaking through the circle and slamming into me. I woke to the sound of Jessica's voice, faint and distant. My vision blurred as I tried to focus, the world around me spinning. You're okay, she said, her voice trembling. I blinked, realizing I was lying on the floor of the living room. Jessica was kneeling beside me, her face pale, but her eyes clear. It's gone, she said, her voice breaking. It's really gone. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to let the relief wash over me. But as I stared into her eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something had changed. We left the house the next day. Jessica insisted it was time to move on, to leave the memories of what had happened behind. I didn't argue. We found a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the house and everything it represented. My name is Ethan, and I used to love reading scary stories. But one story changed my life forever. If you've ever wondered why I stopped sharing stories, sit tight, because this is the scariest thing that ever happened to me. It all started a few years ago when I got a message from a woman named Clara. She told me she was a writer and begged me to read her story on my channel. I love supporting new writers, so I agreed. Her story was dark and unsettling, a tale of obsession and loss. When I finished reading it, I thanked her politely and thought that would be the end of it. But the next day, things took a weird turn. I came home from work that evening to find a note taped to my front door. In big, scrawled letters, it read, "Thank you for reading my story. You'll love the next one." There was no name, but I knew it had to be from Clara. How did she find my address? I hadn't told her where I lived. It sent a shiver down my spine. Trying not to overthink it, I took the note inside, locked the door, and went about my evening routine, brewing coffee, changing into comfy clothes, and settling down to relax. But I couldn't stop thinking about the note. Something felt off. Around midnight, I was about to head to bed when I heard a knock on the door. It wasn't the soft, polite kind. It was loud and frantic. My stomach tightened as I tiptoed to the window to see who it was. Standing there under the dim porch light was a woman. She looked about my age, maybe in her late 20s. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her long black hair tangled like she hadn't brushed it in days. She was pacing back and forth, mumbling to herself. It didn't take me long to realize. This was Clara. I froze. I hadn't expected this. How did she find me? Why was she here? I told myself to stay calm and handle this carefully. I opened the door just enough to talk to her. "Clara," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not sure why you're here, but you need to leave. This isn't okay." She stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You have to read my next story. It's for you. It's about you." Her words made my blood run cold. "No," I said firmly. "I'm done reading stories. Please go home." I shut the door and locked it. That's when she started screaming. She pounded on the door, yelling, "You don't get it! I wrote this for you! I love you!" Her voice was shrill and wild, like something out of a horror movie. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called 911. While I was talking to the operator, a loud crash came from the living room. I turned and saw shards of glass on the floor. A brick had come flying through the window. Clara was climbing in, her hands bleeding from the broken glass. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, "Read my story!" I panicked and dropped the phone. She charged at me, knocking me over the coffee table. She was stronger than she looked, and her nails scratched at my face as she tried to grab me. I grabbed the nearest thing, a heavy book, and swung it at her head. It hit her hard, and she fell to the ground, unconscious. The police arrived minutes later. They found Clara lying on the floor and me trembling in the corner. The officers handcuffed her while the paramedics checked her injuries. She didn't resist. Instead, she laughed. It was the most unsettling sound I'd ever heard, high-pitched and cold. As they took her away, she looked back at me and said, "You'll never stop thinking about me." She was right. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care about the broken window or the mess she'd made. I couldn't stay in that house. I crashed on a friend's couch for a few days and eventually found a new place to live. But I never narrated another story again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice in my head, whispering, "Read my story." and I wonder if she ever really stopped watching me. So, kids, if you ever hear someone begging you to read their story, be careful. You never know what kind of story they might be bringing into your life. It all started when my family decided to visit a big national park during winter break. My mom, Dad, and I drove out to this small town called Ridge Hollow, just outside the park. Ridge Hollow was a quiet place, with only a few cabins, a gas station, and a tiny grocery store. We stayed in a little cabin at a lodge called Pineview Inn. Introducing my family mom, Nora. She's always prepared for anything and never goes anywhere without snacks and a first aid kit. She loves nature and was really excited about seeing the park. Dad, Elliot. He's more of a relax by the fire kind of guy. He likes to joke around, but he also gets really serious when it comes to safety. Me, Caleb. Like I said, I love mysteries. I've read every book in the Case Closed series and dream of being a detective someday. On our second night there, after spending the day hiking and taking pictures, we were driving back to Pineview Inn. It was pitch black outside, and the roads were empty. Dad was driving. Mom was looking at pictures on her phone, and I was staring out the window, hoping to see a deer, or maybe even a bear. Suddenly, the headlights caught something on the side of the road. It looked like someone lying down, with their feet sticking out toward the road. "Dad, stop the car! There's someone there!" I shouted, pressing my face against the window. Dad slowed down but kept driving. "It's probably just trash, Caleb. People dump all kinds of stuff out here." "No way," I said. "That was a person. I saw their feet." Mom leaned forward. "Are you sure, Caleb? It's pretty dark out there." "I'm sure," I insisted. Dad sighed. "All right, let's check it out." Dad turned the car around and we drove back slowly. When the headlights hit the spot again, I felt a chill. There, on the side of the road, was a woman. She was lying on her back, wearing a long black coat, black pants, and boots. Her face was pale, and her hair was tied back neatly. Mom gasped. "Oh my gosh, she's just lying there." Dad rolled down his window and called out, "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman didn't move. "Say something louder," Mom urged. Dad leaned out of the window and yelled, "Hey, are you all right?" The woman suddenly sat up, and I nearly jumped out of my seat. Her name was Lila. She looked like she was in her late 40s, and her voice was soft but shaky. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm trying to get to the Ridge Hollow gas station. My mom is meeting me there." I noticed her hands trembling as she clutched a purse and 3 water bottles. Even though she was wearing a nice coat, she didn't have gloves or a hat, and it was freezing outside. Mom whispered, "Why is she out here alone?" Dad frowned. "That gas station is miles away." Dad offered to give her a ride, and Lila hesitated for a moment before nodding. She climbed into the back seat, and I noticed how tired she looked. She had dark circles under her eyes and kept looking down at her hands. Mom handed her a blanket from the trunk and said, "Here, wrap this around you. It's too cold out there." "Thank you," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. As we drove, Mom tried to make conversation. "Where are you from, Lila?" "Just a little ways from here," she said. "I was staying at a hotel in town." "Why were you walking?" Mom asked. Lila's eyes flicked toward the window. I needed to leave." Dad and Mom exchanged a glance, but they didn't push her for more details. When we pulled into the Ridge Hollow gas station, it was completely dark. The station was closed, and there was no one else around. Lila climbed out of the car and sat on the bench outside the store. "Are you sure your mom's coming?" Dad asked. "She'll be here soon," Lila said. "Thank you for the ride." As we drove back to Pineview Inn, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Lila had seemed scared, and the way she kept looking around made me think she was hiding from someone. When we pulled into the parking lot, we saw 2 police cars outside the lobby. Dad parked, and we walked over to one of the officers. "Is everything okay?" Dad asked. The officer nodded. "We're looking for a missing woman. She left her hotel earlier tonight." I felt my stomach drop. "We just gave her a ride to the gas station," I blurted out. The officer's eyes widened. "Can you show me where?" We led the police to the gas station, and they found Lila sitting on the bench. She looked relieved when she saw them. Later, we found out why she was so scared. Lila had been staying at a nearby hotel with her husband, who had hurt her badly during an argument. She'd escaped while the hotel staff called the police. She thought her husband might come after her, so she ran as far as she could in the dark. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Lila. I wondered if she was okay now, if her mom really came to get her, and if her husband was arrested. One thing was for sure. After that night, whenever I told Dad I saw something unusual, he listened. And that's the story of the woman on the road. It was the summer of 1990, and I had just turned 15. My name is Alex, and I lived in a small town in the middle of nowhere. Well, somewhere in rural Virginia. It wasn't much, just a place where everyone knew everyone's business. And the most exciting thing was the county fair once a year. My father had spent most of his life in the army, but when he retired, he decided to settle here. It was supposed to be a peaceful life after all the chaos of military life, but the stillness began to eat at him. For a few years, my dad kept himself busy with projects around the house and working on his old truck. But after a while, the boredom got to him. Even though my mom was a bookkeeper and made a good living, he didn't like sitting around. So he started taking up jobs at the local gas stations. It wasn't because we needed the money, it was because he needed something to do, something to keep his mind sharp. I didn't mind it though. Sometimes he would let me come along and help out. It wasn't much, just stocking the coolers or filling the shelves. In a small town like ours, the owners didn't mind much, as long as I didn't sell any alcohol or cigarettes. It was a quiet life, one I had grown used to. One evening in early fall, I was sitting at a table by the big windows of the gas station convenience store. I had my feet up on the seat, a half-empty Mountain Dew beside me and a book in my hands. I liked coming here after school. It was a place I could be alone, do my homework, or just kill time. That evening, though, something caught my eye. I looked up from my book and saw a figure walking across the parking lot. It wasn't unusual for people to stop by, but it was strange that she was coming from the direction of the highway. The interstate ran through our town, but we rarely got people walking from that way, especially not this time of night. I thought she might have broken down or something. She was walking slowly, almost as if she didn't have anywhere else to go, and as she got closer, I saw she was wearing an old jacket that didn't look like it belonged in the humid summer heat. When she stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled, and she looked around for a moment before her eyes landed on my dad behind the counter. "Hi, I need help," she said, her voice soft and kind of shaky. I remember feeling a bit of unease when she spoke, but I didn't know why. She wasn't doing anything wrong, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My dad, though, just nodded without saying much. He was usually pretty friendly with customers, but he seemed distant with her. "I'm stranded," the woman continued. "I need a ride up to Springfield. My car broke down a few miles back on the highway. Could you help me out?" I watched as my dad didn't respond right away. It was as if he was weighing his options, or maybe he just didn't like the way she looked. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I'm working right now, ma'am. I can't really leave. I'm sorry." Her expression changed immediately, like she wasn't used to being rejected. She stood there for a second, eyes flicking between me and my dad. She seemed to hesitate before turning her gaze toward me. "Can he drive me?" she asked, pointing at me. I was confused at first, but when I saw my dad's eyes shift to me, he shook his head. I could see the warning in his expression, but the woman didn't notice. I just got my learner's permit," I said awkwardly, trying to keep the conversation light. "I'm not supposed to be driving anyone." The woman's face twisted into something I couldn't quite understand. Then she muttered a curse under her breath. Great. So now I'm stranded because of some rules. She didn't stop there. She started to raise her voice, her words sharp and angry. Just get out of my way then, she snapped at my dad. My father's face hardened, and without saying another word, he waved toward the door. Leave, he said simply. The woman's anger flared for a second, and then, as if she couldn't control herself anymore, she yanked open the door so hard that the glass rattled. She stormed out of the store, muttering under her breath. I stood there unsure of what just happened, but as I watched her walk toward the highway again, a strange feeling crept over me. Something wasn't right. It wasn't until nearly a year later, just a few days before my 16th birthday, that I would realize just how strange that encounter really was. I was sitting in my bedroom, trying to cram for a math test, when I heard my dad's voice echoing from the living room. Alex, get in here now! I jumped up, my heart racing. It wasn't often that my dad sounded that urgent. I rushed into the living room where my dad was pointing at the TV. There, he said. That's the woman. I looked at the screen and sure enough, there she was. The same woman who had been at the gas station just a year before. But now, she wasn't just a stranger in need of a ride. She was the subject of a news report. The woman had been arrested, and the reporter was talking about her involvement in a string of unsolved murders across the state. They showed her mugshot, and the details were chilling. The woman, whose name was Sharon Wells, had been convicted of several murders over the years, and she had been sentenced to death. I couldn't believe it. I had almost given her a ride. She had asked me, looked me in the eyes, and for a moment I had considered it. I had no idea how close I had come to something terrible. But what disturbed me even more was the way my dad had reacted. He wasn't just trying to protect me from breaking the law, he had known something was off. He must have seen something in her eyes when she walked in that day. Something dangerous. I started paying more attention to things after that, trying to trust my instincts more. It wasn't just that woman I had to worry about. There were other times when my gut had told me something wasn't right, but I didn't listen. One day, a few months after I turned 16, my mom had to stop by a store to pick up some supplies for her bookkeeping work. I had gone with her that day, but I wasn't expecting much excitement. The store was in a rundown area of town, and I had learned to stay alert, especially around the homeless people who often hung around there. As we walked into the store, I saw Randy, the homeless man who often sat outside. He was a regular and never caused trouble, so the store owners let him rest there on rainy days. That day, it was storming outside, and he was sitting by the door, his face hidden under the brim of his old hat. Mom asked me to wait by the counter while she took care of business. I started playing with an old, broken cash register, pressing the buttons and pretending to run the store. It was quiet. Too quiet. Then, out of nowhere, I felt someone tug on my shirt. I spun around, expecting to see my mom, but instead, I found myself face to face with an older couple. They didn't look like anyone I knew. The man had deep wrinkles, and the woman had a cold smile that made my skin crawl. "Hey kid," the man said. "You want a puppy? We've got some in the car. Come on, we'll show you." My heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. I remembered my mom's warnings about strangers, especially people offering things like that. I tried to back away, but the man grabbed my arm, his grip strong despite his age. "Come on," he growled, pulling me toward the door. I froze, panic setting in. But then, just as I was about to scream, Randy appeared out of nowhere, standing between us. "Everything okay here, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. The couple stopped, looking at each other, then quickly muttered something about looking for their son. They rushed past Randy and out the door without another word. My heart was racing. I knew they weren't looking for a lost child. They were trying to take me. I quickly ran to my mom, who had heard the commotion and came over just in time to stop the couple. After they left, Randy gave me a knowing look. He had seen it too. That was the moment I realized how dangerous the world could be, and how much I needed to trust my instincts. Months passed, and I still couldn't shake the memory of that day. The woman at the gas station, the strange couple, and the close calls I had experienced, it all started to feel like one big warning. I didn't know who to trust anymore. My dad, who had seen through Sharon Wells from the start, kept his eyes open for anything out of the ordinary. He never let me forget that feeling of unease we both had when we met her. Eventually, I came to realize that the world isn't always as safe as it seems, and that trust, true trust, isn't something to give lightly. The woman's arrest made the news everywhere, and as I watched the reports, I couldn't help but feel lucky. My dad had been right. He had known exactly what to do. Years later, I still think about that night. I've driven by that gas station a few times, but it never feels the same. The memories are all there, lurking in the back of my mind, a reminder of how close I came to something terrible. I've learned a lot since then, about trusting my instincts, about the world being a lot darker than we like to believe. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget what happened. Because sometimes, the people you least expect are the ones who can hurt you the most. It's been years now since that day with Sharon Wells, the strange couple, and everything else that followed. I'm in my late 20s now, far removed from that small town and those quiet nights. I moved away after high school, seeking a new life far from the people and memories that still haunted me. But the truth is, no matter how far I've gone, those moments are always with me. I've seen things, heard stories, and met people from all walks of life. Some good, some bad, but all of them have shaped me in ways I never expected. But every now and then, I'll think back to that gas station, to my dad's warning eyes and Randy's quiet protection, and I can't help but feel that those lessons, those strange, unnerving encounters were meant to shape who I became. A few months ago, I returned to my old town for a family reunion. The gas station is still there, but it's changed. The new owners put in a fresh coat of paint, made it look modern, but the windows are the same place I used to sit and stare out into the quiet, empty parking lot. I decided to stop by. It felt like a weird pull, like something was calling me back. When I walked in, it wasn't like I remembered. The air was different and the shelves were stacked with new, unfamiliar products. But there was one thing that hadn't changed: the feeling. That same odd sense that had crept up on me years ago. The counter, where my dad had stood all those years ago, was still there. And for a moment I could almost hear the sound of his voice, the way he'd talk to regular customers or how he'd joke with me when I helped him out. I missed him a lot. I glanced at the old register where I'd played with the buttons, and the memories of that day, the day the strange woman walked in and changed everything, came flooding back. It felt like time had slowed for just a moment, and I could see my younger self, unaware, naive, trusting people too easily. I had to admit, I didn't listen to my gut back then, not until it was too late. But life has a funny way of teaching you things. I'd been through a lot since then. Learned to be cautious, to always trust my instincts no matter how small the warning signs seemed. Every person I met, every odd encounter, shaped me into someone different, someone wiser. As I stood there, the clerk behind the counter asked if I needed help, and I just nodded, lost in thought. I decided it was time to leave, to get back to my life. But as I walked out the door, something caught my eye. There, standing by the old gas pumps, was a man who looked like he had just come out of nowhere. He wore a leather jacket, his face hidden beneath a cap, and he stood there, as if waiting for something. For a moment, my heart skipped a beat. My mind immediately flashed to the woman from so many years ago, to the unease that had filled my chest when I first saw her. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling didn't leave. My instincts were on high alert. I turned away quickly, not wanting to take chances. As I drove away, the image of the man stayed with me, the nagging feeling that something was wrong hanging in the air like a storm cloud. But I knew something now that I didn't back then. When you sense danger, you don't wait to find out if you're right. You trust your gut. even if it means walking away. As I pulled out of the parking lot and drove down the quiet, familiar streets of my old town, I finally realized just how much those experiences shaped who I am today. They taught me to be aware, to listen to the silence, to notice the things that aren't said aloud. They taught me to trust myself more than anyone else. In a way, Sharon Wells, the couple at the store, even Randy, they all played a part in shaping me. And I don't think I'll ever forget what they taught me, even though I wish I could. Because in the end, the real lesson wasn't just about survival. It was about the power of paying attention to the world around you and never underestimating your own instincts. That's the only thing that can protect you when everything else is uncertain. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget what happened. Because sometimes the most dangerous moments aren't the ones we see coming. They're the ones we almost miss. It was a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and not much ever seemed to happen. When I think back to those days, I can still hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the smell of fresh coffee, and the distant sound of cars whizzing by on the highway. My dad used to say that small towns like ours were boring, but in his case, boredom had led him to work at the local gas station. My father, a former Army man, had served for 21 years before retiring. He'd always been proud of his service, though I don't think he ever truly understood how much it had changed him. He never really adjusted to civilian life after he got out. At first, it didn't seem to matter. We moved to a small town in Florida, where my mom worked as a bookkeeper. The rent was cheap, the people were friendly enough, and everything felt easy. But then, after a few years, the weight of boredom started to settle in. My dad was a man of routine, always busy with something. But after he left the military, he struggled to fill his days. Retiring from the Army had given him some peace, but it also left him restless. My mom made enough money for us to live comfortably, but that wasn't enough for him. So, in his usual stubborn way, he decided to go back to work. He took a job at a gas station just off the highway, working late nights and weekends. He figured it would give him something to do, and it kept him busy, which was all he really wanted. It wasn't much. The owners were nice enough and didn't mind me hanging around. I'd go there after school, helping my dad with stocking the coolers or running the register as long as I didn't sell any beer or cigarettes. It was a strange kind of job, but it felt normal to me. I didn't mind it. My life at that time was pretty simple. School, work, home. At 15, I'd just gotten my learner's permit, and my dad had started letting me drive him to and from work. He'd let me get some driving experience, both during the day and at night. One night in 1990, right after my birthday, everything changed. It was a typical evening. I was sitting in the corner of the gas station where we had a small table set up by the windows. I had a book in hand, a Mountain Dew sitting next to me, and some snacks spread out. My dad was behind the counter greeting the few customers who came in. It was quiet, but that was normal for the small town. It was about 9:30 p.m., and the parking lot was mostly empty. The occasional car would pull up to the pumps, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then something caught my eye. It wasn't much at first, just a figure walking up the driveway from the direction of the interstate. It wasn't strange for someone to walk into the station, but it was strange for someone to be walking from the highway. The station was right off Interstate 75, and the area around it was mostly flat, empty land. You didn't get many pedestrians. I figured she'd probably broken down somewhere and needed to use the phone. But the more I watched, the stranger it seemed. The woman walked steadily, her face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. She was dressed in a long coat, the kind you might wear during cooler weather even though the night was warm. It didn't make sense. Nobody ever walked from the highway. The closer she got, the more uneasy I felt, but I couldn't explain why. Something about her just felt off. She came through the door with the same steady pace, her boots tapping lightly against the floor. I watched her for a few moments as she took in the interior of the store, glancing at the shelves, the old cooler at the back, and then moving to the counter. My dad was busy talking to a customer, but he noticed her immediately. I could tell he was uncomfortable. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her as she approached the counter. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice soft but clear. "I've broken down a little north of here. I need to get to Ocala, but I'm stranded." She glanced at my dad, then at me, her eyes lingering for just a moment too long. "Could you give me a ride?" My dad's expression shifted immediately, like a switch had been flipped. He wasn't the type to turn people away, especially not women in need. But this time, he was different. He didn't smile at her or offer the usual pleasantries. He just looked at her and shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm working. I can't help you out." I watched the woman's face carefully. Her smile faltered for a brief moment, but she didn't back down. Instead, she turned and looked directly at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. She tilted her head, like she was studying me. Then she spoke again. "What about him?" she asked, nodding toward me. I blinked, confused. "What?" I said, looking from her to my dad. "I'm not really able to." "He can give me a ride," she said, cutting me off, her voice suddenly insistent. "He has a learner's permit, doesn't he? It's just a short drive. He'll be fine." My dad's face darkened, and I could see the tension in his body. He didn't say anything at first, but I could feel the heat of his gaze. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, but instead he subtly shook his head. I was confused. I thought he might be overreacting, but there was something about his demeanor that told me this was different. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said again, his voice colder this time. "He can't take you, it's not safe." The woman's face twisted into a frown. "You don't want to help me?" she spat, her voice rising. "What kind of people are you?" I could feel the tension in the air thickening. I glanced at my dad, but his face was unreadable. He just nodded toward the door. "I think it's time for you to leave." The woman's lips curled into a snarl. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. It was hard to see exactly what it was, but she gripped it tightly. "You'll regret this," she muttered under her breath. "You don't know who I am." I wanted to step in, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I could only watch as she turned sharply and stalked out the door, slamming it behind her with a force that made the glass rattle. My dad sighed, rubbing his forehead. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes focused on the door. I didn't know what to think. I watched her walk down the driveway and out to the highway, her figure fading into the darkness. She made her way to the northbound on-ramp, and I didn't take my eyes off her until she disappeared into the night. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My dad never spoke about what had happened, and I didn't press him. He didn't need to say anything for me to know he was upset. I could see it in his eyes. That night I went to bed with a strange sense of unease, but I didn't understand why. It wasn't until months later that I found out just how close I had come to being part of a far darker story than I ever could have imagined. The next part of the story would change everything. It wasn't just a strange encounter. It was a warning I had failed to see. But that's a story for later. For now, I just couldn't get her face out of my mind, or the way she looked at me as though she had known something I didn't. The night after the strange woman had left the gas station, the air felt heavier than usual. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, the way she'd turned on my dad, or the way she seemed so sure that I could help her, even though I was just a kid. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. For the next few weeks, life seemed to return to normal. I went to school, helped my dad at the gas station, and spent my free time doing what most 15-year-olds do, hanging out with friends, reading books, and generally trying to avoid the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface of my everyday life. But even as I tried to forget about the strange woman, there was a lingering sense of unease that followed me. My dad had been acting differently too. He wasn't quite as chatty as he usually was, and every now and then, I'd catch him staring off into the distance, lost in thought. Whenever I brought up the woman, he would change the subject quickly, almost like he didn't want to talk about it. That only made me more curious. It wasn't until the following spring, a few months later, that everything came to a head. I was sitting in my room one afternoon, reading a book, when I heard my dad's voice yelling from the living room, "Son, get in here, quick!" I jumped up, startled, and ran into the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. My dad was sitting on the couch, his eyes wide as he pointed at the TV. "Look at this," he said, his voice tight with urgency. I followed his gaze to the screen, where a news anchor was reading a report. I wasn't sure what had him so worked up, but when I looked at the image on the screen, my blood went cold. It was a mugshot of a woman, and my stomach dropped as soon as I saw her face. "That's her," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The woman from the gas station. The one who had come in asking for a ride. The one who had looked at me with those unsettling eyes." I couldn't believe it. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The news anchor continued, oblivious to my shock. "Authorities have arrested Sharon Wells, a 38-year-old woman from Jacksonville, on charges of being connected to a string of murders across Florida. Wells is believed to have been operating under several aliases and has been on the run for the past year. She was captured after being identified in a surveillance video from a gas station in Ocala." My dad sat frozen, his face pale as the news unfolded. I felt a chill run down my spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. This woman, this stranger who had come into our gas station just months before, was a murderer. I could hardly process it. My dad's voice broke the silence. "That's her," he said again, his tone thick with disbelief. I knew something was wrong. When she walked in that night, I just felt it. I had a bad feeling about her the second I saw her coming up the driveway. I should have done more to stop her. I looked at my dad, trying to make sense of it all. "But how did she get away? We could have called the cops." "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "But I just didn't trust her. I don't know why. I didn't want to take any chances, so I told her to leave, but I never expected this." His voice trailed off, and for the first time I saw the weight of regret in his eyes. The news anchor continued reading, but my thoughts were elsewhere. My mind was racing, trying to process the details. Sharon Wells had been caught after a year on the run, connected to multiple murders. The part that hit me the hardest was the mention of Ocala, a city that wasn't far from us. It felt like the universe had thrown a curveball, connecting everything back to that one strange night. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. Sharon Wells hadn't just been stranded on the side of the road. She hadn't just needed a ride. She had been scouting. She had been sizing me up, figuring out who she could manipulate into giving her the ride she needed to continue her crime spree. And I had almost fallen for it. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right in front of me. Sharon Wells was a serial killer. She had been roaming the state, preying on unsuspecting victims, and I had almost been one of them. I shuddered at the thought, my mind spiraling with all the what-ifs. I kept replaying that night in my head, thinking of all the little things I hadn't noticed before. The way she'd looked at me, the way she'd tried to convince my dad that I could drive her. She had been playing a game I hadn't even realized I was part of. But that wasn't the only thing that bothered me. It was the timing. I'd seen her just before everything started to unravel. If I hadn't been so naive, if I had pressed my dad to help her, what would have happened? What if I had been the one to drive her to Ocala? What if we hadn't caught her in time? That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions, and the weight of what had almost happened pressed down on me like a 1,000-pound stone. I had always been told to trust people, to be kind, but in that moment, I realized how dangerous it could be to let your guard down. I wasn't just a kid anymore. I was learning the hard way that the world wasn't as safe as I had thought. The days that followed were a blur. Sharon Wells had been arrested, and the news stories about her began to flood the local media. As the police pieced together her history, more details came to light. She had been living under multiple aliases, moving from town to town, always staying one step ahead of the authorities. It was like she had been playing a game of cat and mouse, and we had been the unsuspecting mice. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What had she wanted from us? Had she really been stranded, or had she been looking for her next victim? It was hard to know. But what I did know was that my dad had trusted his instincts that night. He had known something was wrong, and he had acted on it, even though it wasn't easy. A few weeks later, I found out that Sharon Wells wasn't the only one. The police had uncovered a whole network of individuals involved in similar crimes, people who had been operating in the shadows, using fake identities to prey on vulnerable targets. I learned that the gas station had been one of the places she'd been to during her spree. She had walked in with the intent to use me as a pawn, but my dad had stopped her. In the end, Sharon Wells was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The whole town was shaken by the news, but there was a strange sense of relief too. The monster had been caught. The danger had passed. Or so we thought. But even now, years later, I still think back to that night. I still think about the way Sharon Wells had looked at me, the way she had tried to charm her way into my dad's trust. I still wonder what would have happened if I had said yes. Would I have been just another victim? Or would I have been able to stop her? I'll never know. All I know is this: I'll never take that kind of chance again. People aren't always what they seem. And sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who can blend into the background, hiding their true intentions until it's almost too late. I don't think I'll ever forget Sharon Wells or the lesson she taught me. It's a dark chapter in my life, one that I never expected to be part of. But it's one that shaped who I am today. And for that, I'm grateful. Though I wish I could forget the fear that still lingers in my chest when I think about how close I came to being one of her victims. The days that followed Sharon Wells's arrest felt like a strange blur. On one hand, there was a sense of relief that the monster who had been lurking in the shadows was finally caught. But on the other hand, there was a gnawing unease that never seemed to fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that maybe we had all missed something, or worse, that maybe there was more to the story than anyone knew. Life at the gas station slowly returned to normal. My dad went back to his usual routine of working long hours, chatting with customers, and managing the small store. He still had that distant look in his eyes, though. It was like he was processing everything that had happened, even if he never spoke about it. I had learned to leave it alone, but I could see the weight he carried around, the way he would pause and stare off into the distance sometimes, lost in thought. For my part, I tried to focus on the usual teenage distractions. I spent time with my friends, went to school, and tried to pretend like everything was normal. But every time I closed my eyes, Sharon Wells' face would flash before me. The mugshot, the cold, calculating look in her eyes, and the memory of her walking into the gas station kept replaying over and over again in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to becoming one of her victims. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after her arrest, I was sitting at the kitchen table flipping through a magazine when my dad walked in with a serious look on his face. I had grown used to seeing him like this lately, but there was something different this time, an urgency in his step, a tense air about him. "Son, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and careful. I set the magazine down, my stomach dropping. "What's wrong, Dad?" He took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About that woman, Sharon Wells. There's something you don't know. Something I haven't told you." I felt a jolt of fear run through me. I had known something was off. I had known that there was more to the story than what was being told. But I hadn't expected my dad to say this. My heart started to pound. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My dad sat down heavily across from me. His eyes were tired, and for the first time I saw the weight of years in his face. After Wells was arrested, I did some digging. Just to find out more about her. I wanted to know what kind of person she really was. Turns out there's more to her than anyone realized. I leaned in, My curiosity piqued. What do you mean? More than what? What did you find out? Dad hesitated for a moment, like he was deciding whether or not to continue. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost as if he didn't want anyone to hear. I found out that Sharon Wells wasn't just a random drifter passing through. She was connected to something much darker, something bigger than what anyone in this town knows. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had always known there was something wrong with her, something sinister hiding behind her eyes. But now it seemed that my dad's suspicions were deeper than I had realized. What do you mean connected? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Wells wasn't working alone, my dad said, his eyes narrowing. She had a partner, someone else who was helping her, someone who had been right here in this town with us for months, maybe even longer. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. A partner? That didn't make any sense. How could someone have been hiding in plain sight? How could we have missed it? Who? I asked, my throat dry. Who was she working with? I don't know yet, Dad said, his face grim. But I'm going to find out. I think there's more to this story than anyone realizes. I've been digging into Wells' past and I found some things that don't add up. I think she and her partner were using this town as a base of operations. They were planning something. And I think they were going to target more people, maybe even you. I sat there stunned, trying to process what he was saying. A partner? A second person? It felt like my whole world was turning upside down. I'd always thought of the events as a strange coincidence, something that had happened by chance. But now my dad was suggesting that there had been a deliberate plan, that everything, Sharon Wells' appearance at the gas station, her strange behavior, even the way she'd tried to get me to drive her, had been part of a larger scheme. And the thought of being a target, of almost becoming one of their victims, made my stomach churn. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked, my voice shaky. Why didn't you warn me? Dad's eyes softened, and for a moment he looked like the man I had always known. I didn't want to scare you, son. You were already shaken up enough. I didn't want to make it worse. But after thinking about it, I realized that you need to know. You need to be prepared just in case. I nodded, though the words didn't seem to reach me. My mind was reeling. Sharon Wells hadn't just been some random killer passing through. She had been part of a network, a group of people who had been plotting something much darker than I could have ever imagined. I'm going to talk to the police, Dad said, after a long pause. I'm going to get to the bottom of this, and I want you to be careful. Keep your eyes open. Trust no one. The next few days were a blur of questions and uncertainty. My dad continued his quiet investigation, meeting with local law enforcement and digging into Sharon Wells' past. It seemed like every time he uncovered a new detail, it only made the situation more confusing. Sharon Wells had been living under false identities for years, moving from town to town, and it wasn't until recently that the authorities had connected her to a string of disappearances across the state. But there was still no trace of her accomplice, no clue as to who they might be or where they could be hiding. As much as I tried to put the pieces together, I couldn't. The more I learned, the less sense it made. It felt like we were all just pawns in a much bigger game, one that we didn't understand and couldn't control. Then, one night, just as I was beginning to think that maybe it was all over, that maybe Sharon Wells was the last of her kind, the phone rang. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. I heard the shrill sound of the phone echo through the house, and I rushed to pick it up before it woke anyone else. "Hello?" I said, my voice thick with sleep. "Is this the Williams residence?" A woman's voice crackled over the line. "This is Detective Martinez from the Jacksonville Police Department. Is Mr. Williams there?" I froze. Jacksonville? That was the city where Sharon Wells had been from. What could the police want with my dad at this hour? "Hold on, I'll get him," I said quickly, my heart racing. I went to my dad's room and shook him awake, urging him to take the call. He groggily answered the phone, and I could hear the conversation in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. My dad's face grew more and more serious as he listened. Finally, he hung up the phone and turned to me, his expression grim. "Son, we've got a problem." "Is it about Sharon Wells?" I asked, dreading the answer. Dad nodded. "It's worse than we thought. The police just found something. They think Wells and her partner were planning something much bigger. They've been working together for years, and now we're in their crosshairs. It's not over yet." My stomach dropped. The nightmare was far from over, and now it seemed like it was coming for us. "Stay close, son," my dad said quietly. "Things are about to get a lot more dangerous." The phone call from Detective Martinez had changed everything. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sick, tight knot in my stomach that seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. The revelation that Sharon Wells's plans were far from over had put us all on edge. My dad was more distant than ever, and I could see the lines of worry etched deeper on his face. It was clear that he didn't want to talk about it, but I knew that this wasn't something that could be ignored. I didn't know who I was more afraid of. The police, who now seemed to think we were somehow connected to whatever Sharon Wells had been involved in, or the shadows of the past, which seemed to be closing in on us from all directions. Either way, I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the unknown. The days after the phone call passed in a haze. Dad had stopped going to work, or at least he stopped going to the gas station at his usual hours. He said it was for my safety, that we needed to stay low for a while. But I knew it wasn't just about me, it was about him too. It was clear that he was afraid. We spent most of our days inside, keeping the blinds drawn, avoiding any unnecessary contact with the outside world. My friends tried to reach out, but I kept pushing them away. I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess. Every time I asked Dad for more details about the situation, he shut down. It was the first time I'd seen him so closed off, so vulnerable. The man who had always been the calm, unshakable figure in my life was now a man haunted by something I couldn't understand. And the more I watched him, the more I realized that there was something deeper at play. Sharon Wells wasn't the end of the nightmare, it was just the beginning. The turning point came one Saturday evening. The sky had darkened early, the clouds heavy with the threat of rain. My dad had just finished pacing the living room for the third time when the knock at the door came. It wasn't a normal knock, it wasn't even a polite one. It was insistent, forceful, almost like someone was demanding to be let in. Dad froze, his eyes widening as if he'd been expecting it. His hand shot out to grab the baseball bat that always leaned against the doorframe, and he motioned for me to stay quiet, to stay hidden. I didn't argue. My heart pounded in my chest as I retreated into the shadows of the hallway. I held my breath, praying that whoever was at the door would go away. But there was no such luck. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a muffled voice. It was a woman's voice, low and insistent. "We know you're in there, Mr. Williams. Open up." My heart stopped. The voice sounded so familiar. I recognized it instantly. It was Sharon Wells, or at least it sounded like her. But that couldn't be possible. She was in jail. She couldn't be standing outside our door. "Dad?" I whispered, but my voice barely made a sound. My throat was dry, tight with fear. Dad was already motioning for me to stay quiet, his face pale. His eyes flicked toward the window. I followed his gaze and saw a dark silhouette outside, standing just out of view of the porch light. Whoever it was, they were waiting for us to make a move. My dad didn't say a word, but I could tell he was calculating his options. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. My dad's breathing was shallow, his hand still gripping the bat tightly. He stood there, frozen in time, until finally, he made a decision. With a sudden motion, he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back of the house. "Go to the garage," he hissed. "Stay there until I tell you it's safe. Don't make a sound." I didn't need to be told twice. My legs were already in motion before his words fully registered in my mind. I slipped through the hallway, past the back door, and into the dark garage, my heart thundering in my chest. I crouched down behind the old rusted car, hoping that the shadows would hide me. From where I was, I could hear the muffled voices from the front door, but I couldn't make out the words. Then, suddenly, I heard a loud bang, a door slamming open, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew it would only make things worse. I held my breath, praying that no one would find me. The footsteps grew closer, and then everything went silent. I didn't move, not an inch. For what felt like hours, I stayed huddled in the dark, the sound of my own heartbeat deafening in my ears. But eventually I heard the door creak open again, followed by a voice that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Williams," a man's voice said, calm and menacing, "we know you're here. We've been waiting for this. Sharon is just the beginning. If you want to make it out alive, you'll do exactly as we say." I had no idea how long I stayed hidden in that garage. It could have been minutes or hours. It didn't matter. All I could hear was the slow, steady thrum of my heartbeat and the silence that seemed to stretch out into eternity. Finally, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. The footsteps moved away from the house, growing fainter by the second. But I didn't dare move until the world outside felt completely still again. When I finally dared to peek outside, the moonlight revealed an empty driveway. My heart was still racing, but I felt a sliver of hope creeping in. I slowly made my way back into the house, careful to stay low, careful to stay quiet. The silence in the air was deafening. I found my dad sitting on the couch in the living room, his face drawn with exhaustion. His eyes met mine as I walked in, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of something in them, something dark, something terrified. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He stood up, and I noticed the sweat on his forehead. "I think they're gone for now," he said, his voice steady but low. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. My dad's eyes darkened. "Now, we fight back." I nodded, trying to push down the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "How? How do we fight back against them?" Dad's eyes hardened as he looked out the window, his mind clearly racing with plans. "We don't have a choice. They're coming for us, and we need to be ready." That night we prepared for what felt like an inevitable showdown. My dad and I spent hours going over everything we knew about Sharon Wells and her partner, every detail, every clue. We researched their backgrounds, the places they'd been, the people they'd interacted with. The more we dug, the clearer it became. These were no ordinary criminals. This was something much bigger, something much darker. The network they were a part of was sprawling, and the people involved were far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. My dad had always been the kind of man who relied on logic, on careful planning. But now I could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear of not being able to protect me. I knew he was scared, I knew that I was too. But in that moment, something changed. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were hunters. The night passed in tense silence, the weight of our preparations hanging over us. The world outside seemed calm, but I knew it was only the eye of the storm. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin, and we had no choice but to face it head on. The sun barely touched the horizon when my dad and I set to work, making final preparations for the day ahead. It felt like we were gearing up for a war, and in a way we were. The world we knew had been shattered overnight, and now we had to face the truth. Sharon Wells and the people who had come looking for us weren't just some random criminals. They were part of something much darker, something that stretched across borders and had ties we couldn't begin to understand. As the hours passed and the early morning light began to creep across the driveway, I felt the heaviness of the situation settle in. I kept replaying the words the man had spoken last night, his voice dripping with malice. "If you want to make it out alive, you'll do exactly as we say." It was a threat, but it was more than that. It was a promise. They weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted, and I was terrified that what they wanted was us. Dad had spent most of the night researching, making phone calls to people I didn't recognize, people who might be able to help us. The phone conversations were brief, but filled with urgency. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he simply told me that it was better I didn't know. The less I knew, the safer I would be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. If Sharon Wells and her associates had already found us, how long until the others came looking? "I think it's time," Dad said abruptly, breaking my thoughts. He stood by the door, his coat already on, the weight of the gun at his side making him look more like a soldier than a man just trying to protect his family. His eyes met mine, steady but filled with a darkness I hadn't seen before. "We can't wait any longer. They'll come for us today, and we need to be ready." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared for this. But the reality was that we didn't have a choice. We had to face it. We had spent the past few hours fortifying the house. Every door and window had been checked, reinforced, and locked. Dad had pulled out the old weapons stash that had been tucked away for years. Guns, knives, even a couple of crossbows. It felt surreal to be holding them, like we were suddenly thrust into a nightmare. But it was the only way we could be sure we stood a chance. "You stay here," Dad instructed as he handed me the shotgun. It was a heavy thing, the barrel thick and worn from years of use. "I'll be in the yard. Watch the back door. Don't open it for anyone unless you're absolutely sure." "I'm not letting you do this alone," I replied, my voice firm despite the fear that gripped my chest. Dad hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I could see the doubt in them, the concern. "This isn't something you should be involved in. It's dangerous, and I won't let you." "I'm not letting you do this alone," I repeated, my voice stronger this time. There was no arguing with me, not when I was sure about something. He knew that. He finally nodded, his jaw tight, and together we made our way to the backyard where the dense woods loomed like a dark, impenetrable wall. There was something unsettling about them, something alive in the shadows between the trees. My dad had always said the woods were safe, that they were our territory. But now, looking at them through the haze of fear and adrenaline, they felt like a trap waiting to spring. We moved quickly, silently, sticking to the edges of the house. My heart raced, and every rustle of the wind, every distant bird call seemed like a warning. "You've got your eyes open?" Dad asked, his voice low, the kind of whisper that didn't carry but still felt like an order. He always spoke that way when he was in survival mode. I nodded, my fingers tightening on the shotgun, the weight of it grounding me in the present. "Yeah, I'm watching." We crouched behind the garden shed, our eyes scanning the tree line, waiting for the first sign of movement. The world around us was eerily quiet, too quiet. I kept expecting to hear the hum of cars passing on the highway or the distant chatter of people, but the silence pressed in like a thick fog. "Dad, do you think they know where we are?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and then he sighed. "They're not just looking for us, kid. They're looking for something else. They're looking for something much bigger, something connected to Sharon Wells." My stomach churned. "What do you mean?" Dad didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the trees, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something in the distance. "They didn't just target Sharon," he finally said. "They've been targeting people for years. I've been involved in something that I thought was over, but it's not. And now they're coming for us." I didn't know what to say. I could see the regret in his eyes, the weight of everything he had kept from me for so long. But now wasn't the time for explanations. We both froze as a car engine revved in the distance. The sound was faint at first, almost too far to be real, but it grew louder, closer. My pulse spiked. This was it. Dad's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist and pulling me closer. "Get ready," he whispered. "Stay behind the shed. Don't let them see you." I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. I had never been in a situation like this, never been this close to danger. My whole life had been a bubble, a world of normalcy that had now burst wide open. The car engine grew louder, closer. I could hear the tires crunching on the gravel, the sound unmistakable. And then they appeared. 2 black SUVs, their headlights cutting through the dark morning. They rolled slowly down the driveway, their engines purring like predators stalking their prey. I could see the silhouettes inside, but they were too far to make out any details. The vehicles came to a stop just short of the house, and the doors opened with eerie synchrony. A handful of figures emerged, moving with purpose, their faces obscured by the shadows. "They're here," Dad muttered under his breath. I felt a lump form in my throat. This wasn't just about Sharon Wells anymore. Whoever they were, they weren't going to leave until they had what they came for. And I wasn't sure what that was, but I had a feeling it had something to do with us. The figures moved quickly, fanning out across the yard, their footsteps heavy but deliberate. They were professionals. I could see it in the way they moved, in the way they held their weapons, in the way they scanned the area. "Stay low," Dad hissed, pressing his back against the shed, his hand on my shoulder. "Let them pass. We don't want them to know we're here." I tried to steady my breathing, my fingers tightening around the shotgun. I could hear the murmurs of their voices now, but the words were lost in the wind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the intent was clear. They were searching, and they were getting closer. I didn't have time to think. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me, my instincts kicking in. I raised the shotgun, preparing for what was coming. My dad didn't need to say a word. We were both ready. Suddenly, one of the figures broke away from the group, heading straight toward the shed. My pulse raced. "Now," Dad whispered, and we sprang into action. The figure didn't even have time to react. Dad was on him first, tackling him to the ground with the force of a freight train. I was right behind him, leveling the shotgun at the other figures who had started to rush toward us. I wasn't a soldier, I wasn't a trained fighter, but I didn't need to be. I just needed to survive. I squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot shattered the silence, and the figure I'd aimed at dropped to the ground. I didn't hesitate. I aimed at another one and fired again. This time the figure staggered backward, a look of shock on his face before he collapsed. But the others were still coming. The hunt had begun, and we were no longer the prey. The tension in the air was suffocating. My ears were ringing from the shotgun blasts, and my hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the weapon, waiting for the next move. The silence that followed the chaos was almost worse than the noise. I could hear the heavy breathing of my dad still grappling with the man on the ground, his arms locked around the intruder's neck, ensuring he wouldn't get up. I couldn't let my guard down. The others were still out there, and they were not going to stop until they had whatever it was they came for. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. The woods, the backyard, the driveway, all felt like traps now. We were cornered. I glanced at my dad. His face was set in a grim expression, sweat trickling down his forehead as he held the man to the ground with surprising strength. The rest of the attackers were trying to regroup, but they hadn't expected us to fight back. They didn't know who they were up against. "We have to move, Dad," I hissed, my voice barely audible over the chaos. He nodded but didn't let go of the man. "Go to the shed. Now." Without waiting for a second command, I moved, slipping into the shadows as quietly as I could. My eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of movement. The remaining attackers were crouching low, their weapons raised, eyes searching the yard. They weren't going to let us get away, and they wouldn't hesitate to finish what they had started. The shed was my only option. It had always been there, standing in the corner of the yard like a forgotten relic. But now it felt like the last safe place. I sprinted toward it, keeping low to the ground, my breath coming in short gasps. As I reached the door, I could hear the creak of the hinges. The last thing I needed was to alert them to my position. Inside, I found what I was looking for. A rusty old rifle my dad had kept in storage, just in case. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. I didn't know if I was ready for what was coming, but I knew I had no choice. I gripped the rifle tightly, the weight of it grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't powerless. I had to fight. I had to protect us. The sounds of the attackers closing in were unmistakable. They were almost here. I steadied my breathing, aiming through the small cracks in the shed's walls. I could see their figures moving in the distance, their heads scanning for signs of life. The tension was unbearable. My finger hovered over the trigger. Then, I heard it. A familiar voice, urgent and quiet, coming from the other side of the yard. "Don't shoot, it's me." I froze, lowering the rifle. It was my dad. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed to the door, throwing it open just enough to see him crouching near the fence, his eyes wide and frantic. "Dad?" I whispered, almost in disbelief. "We've got to go," he said urgently, looking around. "There are more of them. They know we're here and they won't stop." I nodded, my mind racing. We had to make it to the car, we had to get out. But the moment I turned to move toward the driveway, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like the growl of an animal. A figure stepped out of the trees, and then another, and another. They were surrounding us. The people in the woods, they weren't just criminals. They were something else. They were relentless, and they were everywhere. I knew, in that moment, that there was no escaping them. Not unless we fought back with everything we had. I turned back to my dad. "We don't have much time." He was already moving, his face hard with resolve. "Get to the car. I'll cover you." I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could, the sound of my boots pounding against the dirt ringing in my ears. My heart felt like it was going to burst, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I didn't know how much longer we had before they closed in, but we couldn't let them catch us, not after everything we'd been through. When I reached the car, I yanked open the door and slid behind the wheel, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I could see my dad now, moving back and forth between the trees, firing the shotgun at anything that moved. I could hear the distant crack of gunfire, the low mutter of his voice as he shouted commands to me. "Go, kid! Get out of here!" I started the engine, the roar of the car filling my ears. My hands shook, but I shoved the car into gear, my foot slamming down on the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the gravel, but I didn't care. We had to get away. We had to leave this nightmare behind us. As I sped down the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see the figures in the distance, emerging from the trees like shadows. They were too close. Then I heard it, a deafening explosion of sound. Gunfire loud and close. I twisted the wheel to the left, slamming the gas pedal to the floor, but my eyes never left the rearview mirror. I saw my dad, still fighting, still holding his ground, but there were too many of them. The odds were stacked against us, and then just as quickly as it had started, everything went quiet. The gunfire stopped. The figures disappeared into the woods like they had never been there. I didn't stop the car. I couldn't. We had to keep moving. We had made it, for now. But as the town faded behind us, and the trees swallowed up the house we had once called home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The people we had fought weren't just a group of criminals, they were a force that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And no matter how far we ran, no matter how fast we drove, I knew they would keep coming for us. The car sped down the highway, and I could feel the weight of it settling on my shoulders. My dad was quiet now, watching the road ahead, his face grim. He didn't say a word, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching for any sign of danger. We were survivors, but we were also marked. And as the sun began to rise, casting the world in a soft, golden light, I realized that the fight was far from over. We had made it out, but we hadn't won. Not yet. I'm Mia, 28 years old, and living in Minneapolis. Life has been a bit of a roller coaster since my mom passed away 2 years ago. She was the glue that held our family together, and when she left, it felt like we all just scattered into our own little corners of the world. My dad, James, is blind but fiercely independent. He insists on living alone in his cozy little condo about 10 minutes away from me and my older brother Ethan. Dad says he doesn't want to be a burden. but sometimes it feels like he's the one holding the family together now. Ethan and I live in the house we grew up in, and between the two of us, we manage the family's rental properties. Dad sold a successful energy company years ago, so money isn't a problem. But keeping track of tenants, maintenance, and paperwork is a full-time job. It's not glamorous, but it keeps us busy and close to home. That day, the snowstorm started in the early afternoon. By evening, the streets were buried under a thick, white blanket, and the wind howled like it was trying to blow the entire city away. I was sitting by the living room window, watching the snowflakes dance in the streetlights, when a strange feeling crept over me. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes your heart race. It was more like a quiet, nagging worry that wouldn't go away. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen. It had been a couple of days since I'd last spoken to Dad, and I hadn't heard anything from him today. Normally, he'd call or text to let me know he was fine, but today, nothing. I dialed his number, and the familiar ringtone buzzed in my ear. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Hey, Dad, it's me. Just checking in. Call me back when you get this, okay?" I tried to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. I was worried, and I didn't know why. I set the phone down and told myself to relax. Maybe he was napping or watching TV and didn't hear the phone. Or maybe he was out running an errand. Though the thought of him walking around in this weather made my stomach twist. 10 minutes passed, and the phone stayed silent. I called again. This time, I didn't leave a message. I just stared at the screen, willing him to call me back. When he didn't, I picked up the phone and called Ethan. "Hey, Mia, what's up?" Ethan's voice was calm, like he didn't have a care in the world. "Have you heard from Dad today?" I asked. "No, why?" "He's not answering his phone. I've called him twice, and it just goes to voicemail." There was a pause on the other end. "That's weird. He usually calls back right away." "Exactly," I said, my voice rising. "Do you think he went out in this storm?" "Doubt it. He's not that reckless." "But what if he did?" Ethan sighed. "All right, don't panic. He's probably fine. Maybe his phone died or he left it on silent." I glanced out the window at the swirling snow. "I think I'm going to drive over there and check on him." "You sure? The roads are pretty bad." "I know, but I can't just sit here. What if something happened?" Ethan hesitated. "Okay, but drive slow. And call me when you get there, all right?" "I will." I grabbed my coat, gloves, and scarf and slipped into my snow boots. The cold hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped outside. The wind whipped my hair around, and the snow crunched under my boots as I made my way to the car. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few brave souls shoveling their driveways or scraping ice off their windshields. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned on the engine, and cranked up the heat. My phone buzzed with a winter storm advisory as I pulled out of the driveway. The roads were slick and treacherous, and the snowplows hadn't made it to our neighborhood yet. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my heart pounding with every turn. The 10-minute drive felt like an hour. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the falling snow, and the headlights barely cut through the darkness. I kept replaying all the worst-case scenarios in my head. What if Dad had slipped on the ice and hurt himself? What if he was stranded somewhere and couldn't call for help? When I finally reached his condo, I was relieved to see the faint glow of a porch light. But something caught my attention. A set of footprints in the snow leading to the front door. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, and they went both ways, as if someone had recently left and returned. My stomach knotted. I knocked on the door, calling out, "Dad, it's me, Mia!" My voice was swallowed by the wind. Before I could knock again, the door to the neighboring unit opened, and Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman with a warm smile, stepped out. She was bundled up in a thick coat, her gray hair peeking out from under a knitted hat. "Hello, Mia," she said, her voice cheerful despite the weather. "What are you doing out in this storm?" "Hi, Mrs. Harper," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just checking on Dad. Have you seen him? Oh, yes. My husband gave him a ride to the store about 15 minutes ago. He should be back soon. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of worry. Why would Dad go out in this weather? And why hadn't he called to let me know? Thanks, Mrs. Harper, I said. I'll wait for him inside. She nodded and disappeared back into her condo. I turned back to Dad's door and tried the handle, half expecting it to be locked. To my surprise, it opened. My dad, once again, had forgotten to lock the door. Dad, we've talked about this, I muttered under my breath as I stepped inside. You can't keep leaving the door unlocked. The condo was quiet. The only sound the faint hum of the heater. The warmth was a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside, but it did little to ease my nerves. I closed the door behind me and kicked off my boots, noticing the melted snow tracks leading from the door to the hallway. Dad? I called out, louder this time. No response. I followed the tracks through the living room and down the hallway to his bedroom. The door was open, and the room was empty. His phone was on the nightstand, vibrating as I called it again. My heart sank. If his phone was here, where was he? The snow tracks continued to the bathroom door at the end of the hall. It was closed. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something felt off. Dad always kept the doors open to make it easier for him to navigate. And why would he close the bathroom door if he wasn't inside? I knocked softly. Dad, are you in there? Silence. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Nothing. No running water, no shuffling. Just the muffled howl of the wind outside. My pulse quickened as I slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing an empty bathroom. Everything was in its place, except for one thing. The shower curtain was drawn closed. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Dad never left the shower curtain closed. Never. My mind raced, imagining all the things that could be hiding behind it. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what, but every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I closed the bathroom door and backed away, my hands trembling. I needed help. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't imagining things. Pulling out my phone, I called 911. This is Mia Evans, I said, my voice shaky. I'm at my dad's condo. I think someone's been here. Please, send someone quickly. I hung up and retreated to the living room, locking the front door behind me. The snow continued to fall outside, the world eerily silent as I waited for the police to arrive. The minutes ticked by like hours as I waited in the living room, my nerves on edge. Every sound, the creak of the heater, the soft whistle of the wind through the windows, felt amplified. My eyes darted to the front door, the lock I'd turned, and back to the hallway where the snow tracks had disappeared. Somewhere in my gut, I knew this wasn't just me overthinking. Something was wrong. I glanced at my phone. 10 minutes had passed since I'd called 911. I stared at the screen, wishing for an update, but all I saw was the storm advisory notification glaring back at me. The snow continued to fall, and the wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows. My fingers hovered over Ethan's contact on my phone, debating whether to call him. He'd worry, and I didn't want to make this seem like a bigger deal than it might be. But at that moment, the need for a connection, someone to ground me, won out. I pressed the call button. Hey Mia, did you make it to Dad's? Ethan's voice was steady, almost comforting. Yeah, I'm here, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. But something's off. What do you mean? His concern was immediate. I walked in, and there are snow tracks leading to the back of the condo, into his bedroom and bathroom. But he's not here. His phone is on the nightstand, and the bathroom door was shut. Ethan, Dad never leaves it shut. There was a pause on the other end before Ethan spoke. Did you check behind the shower curtain? No, I admitted. My voice dropped to a whisper. I couldn't. You couldn't? Ethan asked, incredulous. Mia, you need to look. I already called the police, I said, cutting him off. I don't want to touch anything until they get here. Okay, Ethan said, his tone softening. Just stay put. Don't do anything else. I'll head over as soon as I can. Ethan, the roads are terrible. I'll be careful. Don't hang up, all right? Just keep talking to me until the cops show up. I was about to respond when I saw headlights flash through the front window. Relief flooded me as I realized the police had arrived. They're here, I told Ethan. I'll call you back. All right. Stay safe, he said before I hung up. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser, their figures bulky in their winter gear. I quickly unlocked the door and waved them in, the icy air biting at my face as I opened it. Are you Mia Evans? One of them asked. He was tall, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a badge that read Officer Clark. Yes, I said, stepping aside to let them in. I'm the one who called. Clark nodded, brushing the snow off his boots. His partner, Officer Ramirez, a shorter man with kind eyes, followed him inside. You said you think someone's in the condo? I'm not sure, I admitted. But my dad isn't here, and there are snow tracks inside. His phone is in the bedroom and, well, I didn't check everywhere. The officers exchanged a look. All right, Clark said. Stay here while we take a look. Do you have a key to lock the door? I nodded, holding it up. Good, Ramirez added. Lock it once we're in, and don't open it until we tell you it's clear. They moved down the hallway, their flashlights sweeping over the walls and floor. I did as they instructed, locking the door and clutching the key tightly in my hand. My heart thudded as I watched them disappear into the back of the condo. The silence was deafening. I strained to hear any sounds, voices, footsteps, anything, but all I could pick up was the muffled howl of the storm outside. A sudden noise made me jump, a loud knock on the door behind me. My breath caught, and I turned, staring at the door like it might come alive. It's me, Ethan, came my brother's voice, muffled, but unmistakable. Relief washed over me. I hurried to the door, unlocked it, and let him in. He was covered in snow, his hair wet and his cheeks red from the cold. You didn't have to come, I said, but my voice betrayed how grateful I was. Like I was going to let you deal with this alone, he said, shaking the snow off his coat. Where are the cops? They're checking the back, I said, pointing toward the hallway. Ethan nodded, his expression serious. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. I'll wait with you, but if anything happens, we're calling for backup. Minutes felt like hours as we stood there, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, and Ethan kept glancing toward the hallway like he was expecting something, or someone, to emerge. Finally, we heard footsteps. Clark and Ramirez returned, their expressions calm but guarded. Found anything? Ethan asked before I could. Clark shook his head. The place is empty, but we did see the tracks you mentioned. They lead from the front door to the back rooms, but there's no sign of anyone inside now. What about the shower curtain? I blurted out, my voice shaking. It was closed, just like you said, Ramirez answered. But there was no one behind it. The tension in my chest loosened, but only slightly. So what now? We'll file a report, Clark said, and we'd recommend changing the locks and adding some security measures. It's possible someone came in while your dad was out and left before you got here. The suggestion made my stomach churn. Someone had been in here, uninvited, unknown, and unnoticed. Thank you, Ethan said, shaking their hands. We'll take care of it. As the officers left, the condo felt quieter than ever, the sense of unease still hanging in the air. Ethan turned to me, his expression softening. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "It just feels off." Ethan nodded. "Let's clean up the snow tracks and lock everything up. We'll wait here until Dad gets back." We grabbed towels and started wiping the floor, erasing the footprints that had unsettled me so much. As I cleaned, my mind kept racing. Who would come into a blind man's home? Why? And how long had they been watching us? By the time we finished, the storm outside had calmed slightly, the wind less aggressive but the snow still falling steadily. We sat on the couch, both of us lost in thought, waiting for Dad to come home. It was nearly an hour later when we heard the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. Ethan and I froze, exchanging a glance before rushing to the window. There he was, Dad, bundled up in his thick coat, walking slowly but confidently toward the door. Relief and guilt hit me all at once. He had no idea what we'd been through tonight. "Dad!" I called as I opened the door, rushing to help him inside. "What were you thinking going out in this weather?" "Nice to see you too, Mia," he said with a small smile, his milky eyes turned slightly in my direction. "I just needed a few things from the store. Mr. Daniels was kind enough to give me a ride." "Dad, we've been worried sick," Ethan said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I didn't mean to cause a fuss," Dad said, removing his gloves. "What's all this about?" Ethan and I exchanged a look. "We think someone was in your condo while you were out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad's face fell. "What? Are you sure?" I nodded. "There were snow tracks inside, and your bathroom door and shower curtain were closed." He frowned, his brow furrowing. "I didn't close them. I always leave them open, you know that." "Exactly," Ethan said. "The cops checked everything, but they didn't find anyone. Still, we think it's best to change the locks and add security cameras." Dad sighed, his shoulders slumping. "All right, if it'll make you feel better." "It's not just for us, Dad," I said softly. "It's for you." We spent the rest of the evening securing the condo as best we could, moving furniture and checking windows. As the snowstorm finally began to die down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Someone had been here, watching, waiting, and I couldn't help but wonder if they'd come back. The next morning, the storm had left the world covered in a thick blanket of snow. The roads were slick and the sky hung heavy with gray clouds. Ethan and I stayed overnight at Dad's condo, unwilling to leave him alone after the unsettling events. The atmosphere inside the house was tense, and even though we'd secured all the locks and double-checked the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Dad, oblivious to the unease that gripped Ethan and me, busied himself with his usual morning routine. He moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, his hands deftly navigating the counters and cabinets. He was humming softly to himself, a tune I vaguely recognized from my childhood. Ethan and I sat at the small dining table, watching him. "We should call a locksmith today," Ethan said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. I nodded, though my mind was already racing ahead. A locksmith wasn't enough. Whoever had been in the condo had gotten in easily. Maybe they even had a key. But how? And why? The questions looped in my mind, unanswered. "You two are awfully quiet," Dad said suddenly, his head tilting slightly as if sensing our discomfort. "Is everything all right?" Ethan shot me a look that said, "How much should we tell him?" I hesitated before replying. "We're just worried, Dad," I said. "About last night." Dad set a mug of coffee on the counter, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't want you two to worry yourselves sick over this. These things happen sometimes. Maybe it was a mistake. Someone might have thought they were in the wrong place." "Dad," Ethan said firmly, "someone came into your home while you were out. That's not just a mistake. We need to take this seriously." Dad sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. All right. Do what you need to do. Call the locksmith, set up cameras, but don't let it consume you. I glanced at Ethan, who nodded and pulled out his phone to start searching for locksmiths. Meanwhile, I decided to poke around the condo a bit more. Something didn't sit right with me about the whole situation, and I needed answers. The first place I checked was the small closet near the front door. It was where Dad kept his coats, shoes, and a few odds and ends. Nothing seemed out of place, but as I moved one of the coats aside, a faint, metallic clink caught my attention. I reached down and pulled out a small key. It wasn't one I recognized, and it didn't look like it belonged to any of the locks in the condo. "What's that?" Ethan asked, appearing behind me. "I don't know," I said, holding it up. "I just found it in the closet." Dad's ears perked up at the sound of our voices. "What are you two up to?" "Dad, do you know what this key is for?" I asked, bringing it over to him. He held out his hand, and I placed the key in his palm. He ran his fingers over it, his expression thoughtful. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't feel familiar. Maybe it's one of yours?" I shook my head. "I've never seen it before." "Let's not jump to conclusions," Ethan said, though his tone suggested he was just as uneasy as I was. "It could be nothing. Or it could be something," I countered. "I think we should try to figure out what this opens." After breakfast, we decided to do just that. Ethan and I went around the condo, trying the key in every lock we could find. The front door, the back door, the bedroom closets, none of them fit. Frustration began to bubble up inside me as each attempt proved fruitless. "Maybe it's for something outside," Ethan suggested. "A storage unit or a mailbox?" Dad shook his head. "I don't have any storage units, and the mailbox doesn't lock." Ethan and I exchanged a glance. "Let's check anyway," I said. Bundling up against the cold, we stepped outside. The snow was piled high, and the air was sharp and biting. The mailbox, as Dad had said, didn't have a lock. We checked the small storage shed at the edge of the property, but the key didn't fit there either. As we stood in the cold, staring at the key in my hand, a thought occurred to me. "What if it's not for anything here?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, shoving his hands into his pockets to keep them warm. "What if it's for another unit?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan frowned. "You're suggesting someone from the building might be involved?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's worth considering." Back inside, I decided to approach Dad's neighbors. The building had only a few units, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to ask if anyone recognized the key. Ethan stayed with Dad while I went door to door. The first unit I visited belonged to an older couple, the Daniels. They were kind and polite but didn't recognize the key. The next unit was empty, the tenants having moved out recently. The third unit, however, gave me pause. The door was slightly ajar, and there were no sounds coming from inside. I knocked hesitantly. "Hello? Anyone home?" No response. I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with boxes stacked against the walls. It looked like someone had just moved in, or was in the process of moving out. Something caught my eye near the window, a small table with a single envelope sitting on it. The envelope was unmarked, but the way it sat, almost deliberately placed, sent a chill down my spine. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. My heart pounded as I approached the table, the silence in the apartment deafening. I reached out and picked up the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short handwritten note. "This isn't over." My breath hitched, and I dropped the paper like it had burned me. Turning on my heel, I bolted out of the apartment, my mind racing. Back at Dad's condo, I relayed what I'd found to Ethan. He listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. "We need to call the police again," he said. "I know," I said, clutching the key tightly in my hand. "But what are we even going to tell them? That I found a creepy note in an unlocked apartment?" Ethan sighed. It's not just the note. It's the key, the tracks, the fact that someone was in here last night. This isn't just a coincidence, Mia. Dad, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up. Do whatever you need to do, he said. I trust you both. His calm demeanor was almost unsettling. How could he be so composed when everything felt like it was spiraling out of control? The police arrived a short while later. Officers Clark and Ramirez were back, their expressions serious as they listened to what I'd found. Clark inspected the key while Ramirez jotted down notes. This note you found, Clark said. Where is it? I hesitated. It's still in the apartment. I didn't want to touch it any more than I already had. Smart, Clark said. We'll take a look. The officers left to investigate, and Ethan and I waited anxiously with Dad. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. When the officers finally returned, their faces were grim. The apartment is vacant, Ramirez said. The note is the only thing there, and there's no indication of who left it. The locks on the door weren't tampered with. Which means whoever left it had a key, Clark added, his eyes narrowing. Just like the one you found. A heavy silence settled over the room. What does this mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It means, Clark said, someone in this building might be targeting your father. And until we figure out who and why, you need to be on high alert. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a threat. The key sat on the nightstand next to me, a cold reminder of the unanswered questions that loomed over us. Who had been in the condo? What did they want? And most importantly, what were they planning to do next? As I stared at the ceiling, one thing became clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after the police left, I woke to the sound of muffled voices coming from the kitchen. For a brief, blissful moment, I forgot about the nightmare we were living. But then the weight of everything came crashing down, and I remembered. The tracks in the snow, the key, the note. Ethan and Dad were already awake. Dad's voice was steady, calm, as if this was any other day. Ethan, on the other hand, sounded on edge. I hurried to join them, curious about what they were discussing. Ethan had his laptop open on the table, a list of names and addresses displayed on the screen. I did some digging, he said, looking up when I entered. There's something weird about that vacant apartment where you found the note. What do you mean? I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. It's been empty for months, Ethan explained, but the utility bills show inconsistent usage, like someone's been staying there off and on. That's not possible, Dad said, frowning. The management company would have noticed. Unless whoever's been staying there knows how to fly under the radar, Ethan countered. I set my mug down, a knot forming in my stomach. So, what do we do? Tell the police? Ethan hesitated. We could, but I don't think they'll do much without more evidence. I think we need to look into this ourselves. We spent the morning strategizing. Ethan suggested we start by talking to the building's management. If someone had access to the vacant unit, they'd likely have a key. And the management office kept records of all issued keys. The property manager, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Howard, wasn't thrilled to see us. Her office was cramped and smelled faintly of stale coffee. She listened as we explained our concerns, her sharp eyes narrowing. I can assure you, she said, tapping her pen against her desk, all keys to the vacant units are accounted for. Tenants are required to return them when they move out, and we change the locks if they don't. Is there any chance someone could have made a copy? Ethan asked. Mrs. Howard's lips pressed into a thin line. It's possible, but unlikely. We use high-security locks for that exact reason. Can we see the records for the vacant unit? I asked. Her frown deepened, but she nodded. Wait here. When Mrs. Howard returned, she handed us a clipboard with a single sheet of paper attached. The records showed that the previous tenant had returned their key as required. There were no reports of lost or stolen keys, and the locks had been changed after they moved out. "See?" she said, folding her arms. "Nothing out of the ordinary." But something was out of the ordinary. My eyes lingered on the name of the previous tenant, Connor Reed. The name tugged at a memory I couldn't quite place. "Does that name mean anything to you, Dad?" I asked, passing him the clipboard. Dad ran his fingers over the paper, his expression unreadable. "Connor Reed? No, I don't think so." But his hesitation made me suspicious. We left Mrs. Howard's office with more questions than answers. As we walked back to the condo, I pulled out my phone and started searching for Connor Reed. It didn't take long to find a profile on social media, a man in his late 20s with a cocky grin and a penchant for posting pictures of expensive cars and vacations. Ethan peered over my shoulder. "He doesn't exactly scream model tenant, does he?" "No," I agreed. "And look at this." I scrolled through his photos until I found one taken in front of a familiar building. Dad's condo. The caption read, "Best decision I ever made. Goodbye, old life." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You think he's connected to all this?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's too much of a coincidence to ignore." That afternoon, we decided to visit Connor Reed's last known address, a small house on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. But when we knocked on the door, there was no answer. We circled the house, peering into the windows. The inside looked abandoned, dust-covered furniture, unopened mail on the floor. But something about the scene felt off, like it had been staged to look empty. "Let's go," Ethan said, tugging on my arm. "We're not going to find anything here." But as we turned to leave, a car pulled into the driveway. A man stepped out, his face shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone guarded. "We're looking for Connor Reed," I said. "Do you know him?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "My dad used to live in the same building," I explained. "We just have some questions about—" "Connor's not here," the man interrupted. "And if you're smart, you'll stop looking for him." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Ethan stepped between us, his stance protective. "We're just trying to figure out what's going on. No need to get hostile." The man snorted. "You don't know what you're getting into. Leave it alone." He climbed back into his car and drove off, leaving us standing in the driveway with more questions than ever. Back at the condo, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. The man's warning played over and over in my mind, and I couldn't decide if it was meant to scare us off or keep us safe. Ethan and I sat at the table, poring over everything we'd learned. Dad listened quietly, occasionally offering his input. "Connor Reed," I said, tapping the table with my pen. "Who is he, really? Why did he leave the condo? And why does it feel like he's tied to all of this?" Ethan rubbed his temples. "We need more information. Maybe the police can dig into his background." But before we could call them, Dad spoke up. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice heavy with regret. Ethan and I exchanged a worried glance. "What is it?" I asked. Dad took a deep breath. "Connor Reed wasn't just a tenant. He used to work for me, back when I still ran the company." My heart skipped a beat. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" "I didn't think it was relevant," Dad admitted. "He was fired years ago for stealing company property. I haven't heard from him since." Ethan leaned forward, his expression intense. "Do you think he holds a grudge against you?" "I don't know," Dad said, his voice tinged with sadness. "But if he's involved in this, it's not just about me. It's about all of us." The revelation changed everything. Connor Reed wasn't just a random name on a piece of paper. He was someone with a motive. And if he was the one behind the break-in, the note, and the key, It meant he'd been watching us for a long time. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, a sense of urgency settled over us. We weren't just trying to solve a mystery anymore. We were trying to protect our family. And whoever was out there, watching, waiting, wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The night after Dad's revelation, the atmosphere in the condo felt heavy, as if the walls were closing in on us. Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table, our minds racing with possibilities, while Dad retired to his room, his silence louder than any words he could have said. Connor Reed wasn't just some random troublemaker from the past. He had a personal vendetta against my father, and now, it seemed, he was back to finish what he started. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. If Connor had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike, we were already deep into something we couldn't easily escape. I glanced at Ethan, who was flipping through some old documents on his laptop. "You think we should tell the police what we found?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up, his eyes tired but focused. "I don't know if the police can help us. We don't even know if Connor's involved, and there's nothing concrete to tie him to the break-in. We can't rely on them right now. We need to take control of this ourselves." I sighed. He was right. But that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. Connor knew where we lived. He knew Dad's vulnerabilities. If he really was the one behind the break-in, then there was a good chance he knew exactly how to manipulate the situation to his advantage. I stood up, pacing the kitchen. "We need to find him before he finds us." Ethan nodded, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. "I've been thinking the same thing. I'll start by looking into his background more, maybe his financials, or any connections he's made since being fired. If we can find any indication of where he's been, we can start narrowing down his next move." I turned to look at him. "What about his old friends, his connections? Do you think anyone around here still knows him?" Ethan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's worth checking. I'll make a few calls, see if anyone remembers him. We might get lucky." As the evening wore on, the air grew colder. The wind outside howled, shaking the windows of the condo as snow continued to blanket the streets in thick layers. The storm hadn't let up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to everything that was happening. It was as if nature itself was conspiring against us, adding weight to the already oppressive silence that had taken over our home. Around 9 p.m., I heard Dad's voice from down the hallway. It was soft at first, but as I got closer, I could hear the distinct sound of him talking, more like muttering to himself. I knocked on his door, then stepped inside. "Dad?" I asked gently, finding him sitting on the edge of his bed, his face pale, his hands resting on his lap. He didn't look up right away. His gaze was fixed on something in the corner of the room, like he was staring through the wall. The expression on his face was one I'd never seen before. Fear. Genuine fear. "Dad?" I repeated, moving closer. "What's going on?" He blinked and shook his head, as if coming out of a daze. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to worry you. It's just..." He hesitated, his voice faltering. "I keep hearing footsteps in the hallway, but when I look, no one's there." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, Dad? No one's been up here." "I know," he replied softly, his voice shaking. "But it feels like I'm not alone anymore. Every time I turn a corner, it's like someone's just out of sight, watching me, waiting." A chill ran down my spine. I could see now that his hands were trembling. I'd never seen my father so shaken. "I'm sure it's just the storm," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though my own voice wavered. "The wind can make all sorts of noises." Dad didn't seem convinced. "No, this is different. It's too deliberate." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Was Connor already here? Had he been in the condo all along playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse? I couldn't be sure, but I wasn't about to let my father face this alone. "We'll keep an eye out, Dad," I said, trying to sound confident. "If you hear anything else, come get us." He nodded, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. I knew that he wasn't just afraid of the sounds he'd heard. There was something deeper, something he wasn't saying. Back in the kitchen, I relayed the conversation to Ethan. His face grew dark with concern. "This isn't good. If Connor's really watching us, then he's playing a twisted game. He could be anywhere, and we wouldn't even know." I felt the weight of his words sink in. We were no longer just dealing with someone who was after money or revenge. Connor was toying with us, using fear as his weapon. "We need to stop him before he does something worse," I said, my voice steady now, as the anger began to burn away the fear. "I can't just sit here and wait for him to make the next move. I want to go back to that vacant unit." Ethan shook his head. "Are you out of your mind? We've been over this. There's nothing there." "I don't care," I snapped. "I need to know if he's been living there, if he's been watching us. Maybe there's something we missed. I'm not waiting around any longer." Ethan didn't argue. He could see the determination in my eyes, and he knew it was useless to try and stop me once I'd made up my mind. "Fine," he said, grabbing his coat. "But we're going together, and we're not going in blind. We're bringing the camera, and we're not leaving until we get some answers." We left the condo at midnight. The roads were slick with snow and ice, the world outside eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The storm had subsided a bit, but the wind still whipped through the trees, causing shadows to dance in the streetlights. When we arrived at the building, the parking lot was almost completely empty, save for a few scattered cars. We parked near the entrance and waited for a few moments, the silence pressing in around us. "You ready for this?" Ethan asked, his voice low. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stared at the building, the place that had once seemed so ordinary, so safe. Now, it felt like the epicenter of something dark, something we couldn't escape. "Let's do it," I finally said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. We made our way to the vacant unit, our footsteps muffled by the snow underfoot. As we stood in front of the door, I felt a sudden surge of dread. What if Connor was waiting for us inside? What if this was all part of his plan? But there was no turning back now. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. Ethan pulled out a small flashlight and pointed it at the lock. "We'll take it slow. We're not forcing anything, just checking to see if anyone's been inside." I nodded, my breath catching in my throat. The world felt strangely distant as Ethan turned the knob and the door creaked open. Inside, the apartment was dark, abandoned. It looked the same as it had the first time we'd visited. Dusty furniture, unopened mail, and an unsettling sense of stillness. But this time, something felt different. As we stepped inside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There, on the floor by the doorway, was a set of fresh footprints. The prints were small, the kind that could only have been made by someone wearing thin shoes, probably sneakers, and they led straight into the living room. "Who else would have been here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ethan didn't answer. He just started walking, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as we moved deeper into the apartment. Then we saw it. A small, crumpled piece of paper, discarded on the coffee table. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, and picked it up. It was a note, hastily scribbled in blue ink. "I'm watching, always watching." I felt the blood drain from my face. Connor had been here. He was still here somewhere in this building. And now, he knew we were getting too close. Ethan took a step back, his face pale. "We need to go." Now. I didn't need any more convincing. We turned and ran back to the door, but as we reached the hallway, a loud thump echoed from behind us. We stopped dead in our tracks. Someone was in the building with us. Someone was waiting for us. The thump echoed through the dim hallway, sending a jolt of fear through me. My heart raced as the sound of footsteps followed, slow but deliberate, like someone was trying to catch up with us. Ethan and I froze in place, staring at the darkness ahead of us, our breaths shallow and fast. The stillness of the building was broken only by the soft creak of old wood and the distant howl of the wind outside. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Ethan, my voice barely a breath. He didn't reply, his hand clutching the flashlight tighter, his knuckles white. I could see the tension in his body, every muscle coiled and ready. The footsteps grew louder, and it was clear that whoever was following us was moving closer. We had to make a choice, and we had to make it fast. "Run," I said, my voice sharp with urgency. Without waiting for a response, I turned and bolted down the hallway, my feet pounding against the floor. Ethan was right behind me, his footfalls echoing in sync with mine. We reached the staircase leading down to the building's main entrance, the only way out. As we rounded the corner, the faint sound of a door opening reached our ears, followed by the unmistakable scrape of shoes on the floor. Someone was gaining on us. My mind raced. I knew the building's layout from the numerous times I'd visited, but in this moment, it felt like we were trapped in an unfamiliar maze. The light from Ethan's flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness as we descended the stairs, our breaths ragged in the cold air. Then, a voice called out from above, "You can't run forever!" It was low, almost a growl, filled with menace. I glanced back, just for a second, and saw a shadow standing at the top of the stairs. His figure was tall and lanky, barely visible in the dark, but there was no mistaking who it was. Connor. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had been in the building all along, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. This was no longer a game. He had us cornered. "We need to get to the door," Ethan hissed, his voice trembling with fear but filled with determination. "Now." I didn't need any more convincing. We sprinted down the rest of the staircase, the sound of our footsteps drowning out everything else. As we reached the door, I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, but to my horror, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. "Damn it," I cursed under my breath. We were trapped. There was no other exit, no way out. "Give it up, Ava." Connor's voice floated down the stairs, cold and menacing. "You're not going anywhere." I turned to look at Ethan, panic rising in my chest. "What do we do? We can't just sit here." Ethan's eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that could help. His gaze landed on the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall beside the door. Without hesitation, he rushed over, pulling it off its bracket. "Cover me," he shouted as he turned back toward me, his face set in a determined grimace. I barely had time to process what was happening before Ethan slammed the nozzle of the extinguisher into the lock, releasing a spray of foam that filled the air with a hissing sound. The lock broke with a loud snap, and the door swung open. "Go! Go!" Ethan yelled, pushing me ahead of him. We bolted into the snow-covered parking lot, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't stop to look back. Couldn't stop, not until I was safely inside the car. Ethan was right behind me, and we scrambled into the vehicle, the engine roaring to life as we sped out of the lot. The headlights cut through the snowstorm as we raced toward the exit, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Connor was still out there, somewhere, watching us, waiting. We didn't speak much on the drive back to the condo. The adrenaline from the chase still buzzed through my veins, but the fear was there too, sitting heavy in the pit of my stomach. What had just happened? What was Connor's endgame? And how had he known exactly where to find us? When we arrived back at the condo, I locked the door behind us and checked every window, ensuring that no one could get inside. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. But even though we were safe for the moment, I knew it was only a matter of time before Connor would make another move. "We need a plan," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "We can't keep running, Ava. We have to end this." I nodded, my heart sinking. "I know, but how? He's got the upper hand. He knows this place. He knows us." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "We need to stop hiding. If Connor wants a fight, we give him one. We need to confront him, expose whatever he's planning, and end this for good." It was a dangerous idea, but I knew he was right. We couldn't keep running forever. Connor had already shown us what he was capable of. He wasn't going to stop until he had what he wanted. "How do we find him, though?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "He's been hiding in the shadows. How do we even know where to look?" Ethan took a deep breath and turned to face me. "We start with what we know. We know that Connor has been watching your father for weeks, maybe longer. He's been biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But what's his goal? What does he want from your family?" I shook my head, frustration bubbling up. "I don't know. He's obsessed with my dad, that much is clear. But why? Why now? Why come back after all these years?" Ethan's eyes narrowed as he thought for a moment. Then slowly something seemed to click in his mind. "What if it's not about your dad at all? What if it's about you?" I blinked, my mind racing to catch up. "Me? What do you mean?" "Think about it," Ethan said, his voice steady but urgent. "Connor's been stalking your family, yes, but he hasn't just been going after your father. He's been watching you too. You were at the condo today. You've been to the old building. He knows you're onto him. Maybe that's why he's been so careful. Maybe he's trying to keep you from getting too close." My blood ran cold. "You think he's trying to hurt me? All of this? Just to get to me?" Ethan's face was grim. "It makes sense, doesn't it? He's not just trying to rob your dad. He's trying to break your family, and you're the key. If he can take you down, he can take everything your father has worked for." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't just a break-in anymore. This was personal. Connor wasn't after money. He was after control. He wanted to make my father suffer, and now he was targeting me to do it. "Then we have to stop him," I said, the words coming out with a fierce determination. "No more running, no more hiding. We take the fight to him, and we end it." Ethan nodded. "But we need to be smart about this. We need to lure him out, make him think he has the upper hand, then trap him. He's been watching us for too long. Now it's our turn." I took a deep breath and nodded. This was it. The final confrontation. We would either walk away from this, or we would fall together. But either way, we weren't backing down. The next day, we put our plan into motion. Ethan spent hours researching Connor's past, tracking down old associates, while I focused on trying to predict his next move. I knew I couldn't just wait around for him to make his move. I had to be ready. And when the time came, I would face him head on. It was just after dark when the final pieces of our plan fell into place. Connor was on the move, and we knew exactly where he would be. This was it. We were going to end this, once and for all. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its rusted steel frame casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. This was where Connor had chosen to meet. It was remote, forgotten, and far from any prying eyes. A perfect place for someone like him to try and finish what he started. Ethan drove in silence, his grip tight on the steering wheel. I sat next to him, my thoughts racing. This was the culmination of everything. The fear, the chase, the unanswered questions. Tonight, it would all end. "Are you ready for this?" Ethan asked, breaking the tense silence. "No," I admitted, "but I don't have a choice." Ethan gave a faint smile. "We've got this, Ava. Remember, he's expecting fear. Let's give him a fight instead. When we arrived, the air was eerily still. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling our footsteps as we approached the warehouse. The entrance was a massive sliding door, slightly ajar, letting out a sliver of yellow light from inside. Ethan carried a crowbar, and I held a small flashlight, my hands trembling despite my resolve. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and decay. The faint hum of electricity buzzed from a single overhead bulb, casting flickering shadows on the concrete walls. The space was vast and empty, except for a few scattered crates and a large metal table at the center. And there, leaning casually against the table, was Connor. He looked up as we entered, a smirk spreading across his face. He was tall and gaunt, his dark eyes gleaming with malice. In his hand, he held a knife, its blade glinting under the dim light. "You came," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I knew you would." "Cut the theatrics, Connor," Ethan snapped. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" Connor chuckled, pushing himself off the table. "What do I want? That's simple. I want what's owed to me. Your family owes me, Ava. Your father owes me. And now, you're going to pay." "You're insane," I said, my voice shaking. "My father never did anything to you." Connor's face twisted with anger. "He took everything from me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty space. "Years ago, when your father sold his company, he didn't just sell it. He destroyed lives. My father worked for him, gave him everything, and what did he get in return? Nothing. We lost everything because of your family." I stared at him, stunned. "That wasn't my dad's fault. He sold the company. It was business." "To you, maybe," Connor hissed. "But to us, it was life or death. And now I'm here to settle the score." Before I could respond, Connor lunged at us, his knife raised. Ethan shoved me aside and swung the crowbar, narrowly missing Connor's arm. The clang of metal on concrete rang out as Connor dodged and slashed toward Ethan. "Run, Ava!" Ethan yelled, struggling to keep Connor at bay. But I couldn't leave him. Grabbing a loose pipe from one of the crates, I charged at Connor, swinging with all my strength. The pipe connected with his shoulder and he stumbled back, cursing in pain. "You little..." Connor spat, his eyes wild with rage. Ethan seized the moment to tackle him, knocking the knife from his hand. The two of them grappled on the floor, their grunts and shouts filling the air. I ran to grab the knife, but Connor was fast. He threw Ethan off and lunged at me, pinning me against the wall. "End of the line, Ava," he sneered, his hands tightening around my wrists. I struggled, kicking and twisting, but he was too strong. Panic surged through me as I saw the madness in his eyes. But then, out of nowhere, Ethan appeared, swinging the crowbar with all his might. It struck Connor's head with a sickening thud, and he collapsed to the ground, motionless. For a moment, neither of us moved, the silence deafening. Then, Ethan dropped the crowbar, breathing heavily. "Is he?" I whispered, staring at Connor's still form. Ethan knelt down, checking for a pulse. "He's alive," he said, his voice grim. "But barely." Relief and exhaustion washed over me, my legs giving out as I sank to the floor. "It's over," I said, barely believing the words. "It's finally over." "No," Ethan said, his jaw set. "Not yet. We're calling the cops. He's going to answer for everything he's done." The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the desolate warehouse. Connor was handcuffed and taken away, his head hanging low, but his eyes still burning with hatred. As the officers questioned us, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. This nightmare was finally over, but the scars it left would take time to heal. Ethan stayed by my side, his hand gripping mine tightly. "You did it," he said softly. "You stood up to him. You ended it." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "We did it. I couldn't have done this without you." In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal. My dad moved back into the condo, though he insisted on installing a state-of-the-art security system. Ethan and I stayed close, our bond stronger than ever after everything we'd been through. Connor was charged with multiple crimes, including stalking, breaking and entering, and attempted assault. He would spend a long time behind bars, far away from us. But the true victory was reclaiming our lives, our peace. The fear that had once gripped us was gone, replaced by a sense of strength and resilience. We had faced the darkness and come out the other side, stronger than ever. And as I stood outside the condo one evening, watching the snow fall softly around me, I realized something important. No matter how dark things may seem, there's always a way to fight back. There's always a way to win.